Chapter 11:11. After leaving the fork in the road, they brought along the cartographer and 20 soft maple warriors and walked through the field. At present, it was less than 2 hourglasses before the sky darkened. If not for the nearby villages which might indicate resistance, Harriman and the rest would have already returned to the temporary camp of the 1,000-man squad. After walking for a short distance, they came to a small valley. The trees at the bottom of the valley were not densely packed, but the canopy above them was like a tent. There was a circle of black pebbles around a fallen tree trunk in the forest. There was a soft maple hound in the party, and as soon as it arrived, it jumped to the front and sniffed everywhere, probing everywhere, until it found a path hidden in the bushes, which was difficult to be discovered by outsiders. Many small villages in the southern Tapped Kingdom were like this. Usually, there would be arrangements to cover their tracks, mainly to guard against possible bandit. This also meant that this village was not large. It was even smaller than Cachelin's town. In a village like this, let alone a law clerk and guards, they might not even be able to find a decent weapon in the entire village. When they found the village, the situation was just as they had expected. There were only a dozen farmers holding pitchforks and trembling in fear as they blocked the path to the village. The village behind them was surrounded by a wooden fence as thick as a bowl. There were no arrow towers, moats, or barricades. Looking into the village through the fences that could only protect against wild beasts, the village didn't have a single brick building like the ones used by Tapp's landlords or lesser nobles. Instead, there were small houses built of rammed earth and covered with straw. There were a few crossbow-wielding soldiers in Harriman's party. They symbolically fired a few arrows at the farmers holding pitchforks. They were too lazy to hurt anyone. Immediately afterward, the team that was completely forced to organize scattered. Everyone turned around and ran, running all the way into the village. Of course, they did not forget to close a fence gate. That was more symbolic than practical. Seeing this, Halamund decided to directly shout into the village. Although his Taput language was only average, he didn't expose himself in Valensburg, so it was obvious that others could understand him. Get your village chief, village elder, or whoever in charge to come out and talk to us. We're not bandits. If you cooperate, we won't go in. Otherwise, we'll go in and talk to you. He was 100% sure that the expeditionary force of the soft maple people had no intention of plundering a village like this. Instead of wasting their energy to squeeze the villagers dry of their money, the soft maple people would most likely choose to have the village surrender. Then, they would sign a document confirming the release of the land's tax obligations to certain nobles and landlords. Finally, the village would pay the taxes to them. Now, Harriman had asked the person in charge to come out and talk to them. His purpose was to nail down this point and prevent the soft maple people from entering the village to symbolically plunder some livestock and poultry to replenish the army's provisions. The things found in this small village were not enough to feed a 1,000-man advance party, let alone a 20,000-man army. His words were effective. Not long after, a rather short adult walked out of the village gate. Behind him were 2 farmers who walked very slowly. Oh right. The 2 farmers were also holding pitchforks. Harriman sized up the man in the lead. The man's head was covered in black hair, and was not even as high as his navel. On a closer look, his face did indeed have some features of a child. Thin eyes and a wide mouth that extended toward his cheekbones. He looked both innocent and funny. Looks like a dwarf. Yes, that's right. Looks like we'll have to use our knives before we return to camp tonight. Haha, I bet you'll only need to use your knives once. Are you an idiot? That guy most likely has a family and a business. You only need to use your knives once to slaughter that family of dwarf bastards? Even if you're a kebab, you'll still need to do it 2 or 3 times, right? Why did you tell him that? I want to bet with him. Behind Harriman, some miscellaneous voices could be heard. For some reasons that everyone knew, the people of the Ramsey continent were very hostile to the dwarf race. And because Tapped Island was the place of exile for the dwarf agent family, it was not strange for there to be dwarves or half-dwarves here. However, on the Ramsey continent, dwarves were not so common. Harriman had only seen dwarves as intelligent creatures in King's Landing under the rule of the Scales of Eternal Order. Moreover, one of the dwarves was the main lecturer of mechanical dynamics in King's Landing University. This was definitely one of the most honorable jobs in the Ramsey continent. Compared to the fighting and killing in other places, King's Landing University had its own spirit of inclusiveness. Ha! Keyes, disguised as the young gunner Hugh Hood, squatted down and pinched the long narrow mouth of the soft maple hound that kept barking because of its master's killing intent. "Shut up. That little guy isn't a dwarf. Don't talk nonsense with your eyes wide open." His words immediately attracted the dissatisfaction of some of the people. However, as he turned his head and coldly glanced at them, and the dwarf Grindel touched the handle of his hooked axe, those people wisely chose to shut their mouths. They did not want to spend the night in the military doctor's tent. However, Keyes' words reminded Harriman of something. He carefully looked at the man who looked like the village chief. He had a broad chest and a well-proportioned body. He was dressed like a native of Tap. His shirt and leggings were made of cotton, and his face was exposed from a heart-shaped collar. He had a pair of big hairy feet and a pair of leather sandals. He held a cane in his hand that looked like it was carved out of a slender bone with a belt attached to it. "He's a halfling." Harriman immediately realized that he had made a mistake in his judgment, so he explained to the others. "His body is well proportioned, his head is not exaggeratedly proportioned, his big hairy feet, and he holds a hupak staff. These are all characteristics of a halfling." After hearing the explanation, the restless soldiers calmed down. They were still convinced of Harriman's knowledge. At this time, the halfling with the hupak staff and two farmers with pitchforks had already approached. "My lords," the halfling introduced himself, "my name is Binaro Camille Reem Miro Sumabik. You can call me Binkabik. I'm the village chief of Acorn Village. The villagers are honest farmers who farm for a living all year round." After the introduction, Binkabik grinned like a toad, revealing a mouthful of large yellow teeth. After confirming that he was not a dwarf, 6 soldiers walked out of the vanguard and entered the village in 2s and 3s to check. Soon they came out. They did not do anything like looting or humiliating the women. They only confirmed that there were no hidden soldiers in the village. The next thing to do was simple. The leader of the scouting team took out a document written in Ramsey's common language and Tap's common language, and read aloud a few sentences such as, "The rights and interests of this place have changed. The tyrant and the nobles under his command have disobeyed orders. The soft maple parliament of nobles upholds justice and rules this place," and so on. He read the contents in Ramsey's common language, and did not ask the halfling of Acorn Village if he understood. He then threw the parchment with the seal into the halfling's arms. "Keep it well. If such people appear again," Harriman said in Tap's common language, because he was afraid that they could not read. At the same time, he pointed at the decorations on the halfling's armor. "Take out this parchment and listen to their orders. You should be able to live in this village." Oh, thank you, my lord." Binkabik thanked him repeatedly. Then, he quickly said a few words to one of the villagers who followed him. The latter hurried back to the village, and soon came back with a piglet under his arm. Binkabik pointed at them and bowed to Harriman. "These are my piglets. Please accept them, my lord. Acorn Village is relatively poor and can only afford these things." Just as Harriman was about to refuse, Keyes reached out and took the 2 piglets. "Take them. We can make 2 roast suckling pigs for dinner tonight. Besides, if you don't work for them, they won't be at ease. But if you don't want to take them for free, you can pay them and ask them some questions. Anyway, that demon worshipper who was hung at the fork in the road is quite strange. It's good to ask him clearly." "Oh, that's right." Harriman's mind immediately turned. He took out a few silver square coins and flicked them into Binkabik's hand. "I'll accept the gift. But there are some things I have to ask you." "Don't worry, just tell me what you know." After he finished asking his question, Binkabik hurriedly told him everything he knew. It turned out that the man who was hanged was indeed a villager from Acorn Village. He had previously gone to Valensburg to sell his mushrooms and other fungus food. In the end, when he returned, he was sent back by the guards of Valensburg. He was beaten half to death, and the 2 guards who escorted him hanged him at the fork in the road outside Acorn Village. According to the 2 soldiers, this man had participated in a riot in the city caused by a demon. He had committed a grave crime under the temptation of a demon, so he was sentenced to death. However, because he was tempted, his crime was reduced and he was sent back to his hometown to be hanged instead of being burned in Valensburg. I heard that many similar demon worshippers have been hanged in the surrounding villages. It seems that a demon that can tempt mortals has appeared in Valensburg, and even the county governor has been killed. That's why the county capital has been hunting down demon worshippers recently. Chapter 11-12. The sun gradually set in the west and dusk enveloped the land. At dusk, a gentle breeze blew, causing the long grass to nod and bend, blowing away the insects hidden in the grass. They danced in the golden light, flickering with little reflections. The camp of the 1,000 soft maple soldiers was made up of continuous rows of tents. Because they were only going to stay here for one night, the captain didn't send anyone to cut down trees or erect fences. The 1,000 men built dozens of large earth stoves. Not only did they have to carry iron pots during the march, they also had to carry bricks for the stoves. Dinner was a soup of vegetables, potatoes, and salted meat. Every soldier carried a fried flatbread with them to eat in the broth. It satisfied their hunger and replenished their water. During the march, the soldiers weren't allowed to drink cold water that hadn't been boiled yet. Those who disobeyed would be publicly whipped. Apart from the food, Quess also used the 2 piglets he got from the village chief of Acorn Village to make 2 delicious roasted suckling pigs. They each had a sour apple in their mouth. Their bodies were covered in oil and fragrant, and they were seasoned with honey water. The 2 roast pigs were very popular. Since Grinder had already eaten more than half of them, Harriman decided not to give half of them to the Chiliarch. The next morning, when the sun had just risen, the men diluted the leftover broth with water and added some corn to make hot porridge. After the 1,000 men had a simple breakfast, they immediately set off for the rest of the journey. Not long after they set out, the cartographers on the skimming boats put a copy of the map they had drawn the day before into the hooks attached to the legs of the messenger eagles. They released the big birds back to the eagles' nests in the rear of the main army, so that they could present the latest marching map. The 1,000 men's advance party's route would take about 5 days. The cartographers had brought 7 to 8 messenger eagles, which should be enough in theory. After another half a day, the 1,000 men rested for an hourglass. Because they didn't set up camp, the men didn't have to cook. The soldiers only had flatbread with salt and water, along with some dried berries and nuts they had brought along, and had a hasty lunch. The cartographers who had already eaten lunch on the skimming boats took advantage of this time to travel dozens of kilometers forward, checking and drawing the route of the afternoon march. As usual, Harriman and his fellow adventurers followed more than 20 soft maple soldiers to provide protection for the cartographer who would occasionally disembark from the skimming boat to survey the situation. There were a lot of hills on Tapped Island, so they still landed the skimmer at the top of one of the hills. The cartographers carried their tools and walked down the gangway ladder one after another. About 30 yards from their feet, like moss growing on an old tree, rows of grapevines grew on the hillside. One look and you could tell that someone had taken great care to raise them. They were in groups of 2, always keeping about the same distance, and lined up horizontally along a narrow flight of stairs. The edges of the steps were smooth and rounded, as if they had been there for some time. There were small paths in the middle of the grapevines, winding like vines. At the foot of the mountain was a small valley, similar to the terrain of the acorn village from yesterday. On the other side there was a big forest. In the middle, one could see pieces of farmland. They were standard, symmetrical, and neat. Looking in this direction from the top of the mountain, one could vaguely see some buildings. They had simple but sturdy wooden sheds and fences. The fences against the inside were probably animal pens. In the middle of this huge landscape, a wisp of green smoke rose into the sky, swaying back and forth with the wind. A group of people walked along the steps, walking between the grapevines. Some of the soldiers even casually picked some grapes that looked like they were about to ripen. Keys also picked a bunch to taste. They tasted all right, and the grapes that were about to ripen were not too sour. However, as the group was about to reach the foot of the mountain, everyone, including the cartographers, was very careful to keep quiet. They had basically guessed that the bottom of the valley was most likely a winemaking manor. It was impossible for such a manor to be owned by a farmer in Tap. It might belong to a rich merchant, but it was more likely that it belonged to a landowner, or even a small noble with armed guards. Of course, judging from the size of this valley, even if this was the territory of a small noble, it would be difficult for that noble to afford a large number of guards. At most, there would be a dozen or so professional or even semi-professional soldiers at most. There were 20 elite soft maple soldiers in this group. They had flintlocks, bows, shields, and swords in their hands. In addition to Harriman and his adventurer companions, there was a high probability that they could even take down a noble's manor. Not to mention, as long as they sent a signal, the skimmers at the top of the hill would arrive at the battlefield in no time. The spellcasters, 20 soldiers, and the cannons on the ship would be a piece of cake for them to deal with a small noble's manor. They went around the last section of the mountain path. Below them came the shrill squeak of a door. Going downhill, there were roofs next to each other. Smoke rose in spirals from the middle, spiraling upwards before being blown away by the mountain wind. However, they found that the smoke was not coming from the chimney. The two-story house made of bricks, the brewery made of rammed earth, and most of the ancillary buildings had been razed to the ground. The embers were still burning. The pillars were charcoal, emitting heat. The wooden fences and thatched roofs had been burned away, ironically exposing the inner rooms to the clear blue sky like the leftover ribs of a greedy giant after a meal. Around the ruins, there were at least 30 people lying on the ground, as if they had been carelessly discarded by the same cruel giant. Their bodies were broken and lifeless. Their weapons and other things were scattered around them. They found the side door of the manor, which had been left behind by the fire. The solid wood poked out from the blackened surface, like the copper rod of an old lamp that had just been polished. There was a dead guard beside the door. The dwarf Grinder poked at the door with the handle of his axe. The charred wood fell, but the building itself did not move. So he poked harder with the axe, but the doorframe was still standing. "Very good," Grinder said. "Although the fire has been burning for 2 days, the main building is still quite sturdy. When we explore inside, the whole building shouldn't suddenly fall on top of us." He put the axe blade into the narrow gap between the door and the frame, and pushed it up like a bricklayer's lever. The door finally opened, leaving a trail of black ash on the ground. They opened the door and went in to take a look, only to find that the thick thatched roof had been burned away. The entire manor was exposed to the outside, like a big barrel without a lid. The windows in the high walls were blackened, and black glass shards pierced the sky. It was as if a giant hand had torn off the roof, pierced the beams, and smashed the windows with its finger. They searched quickly, but found nothing. There was nothing to speculate about what had happened here. Perhaps because the hall had been covered with tapestries, even the walls had burned. The bench, the stairs, and the ashes of the fire were still where they had been. Next, they found the dormitory area. It was a long and low hall with many small rooms. Relatively speaking, the damage here was not as serious. One end of the hall was burned down, but for some reason, the fire did not spread, so the other rooms were spared. This manor might have been attacked by the tundra trolls. Those monsters have a habit of migrating in autumn. There were no living people in the house, and nothing to speculate about. The captain of the guards checked the wounds on the bodies of the dead outside the house. Though most of their clothes were burned away, many of them had hideous wounds. The captain thought that the wounds were caused by the claws of the monsters. The tundra trolls do not set fires. Most of them are afraid of fire, because fire can reduce their regenerative ability. Keyes, who was disguised as a young gunslinger, shook his head and used his palm to measure the size of the wounds. At the same time, he gave his own opinion. This place is not far from Valensburg. The nobles and landlords who live here are probably not recluses. If the tundra trolls really pass by this place every year when they migrate, they will definitely think of a way to ask for help from their governor. At the very least, these people with weapons can hide in the manor and close the doors and windows for a period of time. They must have been forced out by the fire and then killed. I agree with you. Harriman agreed. He had just checked the yard of the manor and found that there were still livestock in the barn. Though the cows, horses, goats, chickens, and ducks were mostly dead, and the corpses were stinking and attracting flies, there were still a dozen fat pigs in the barn that were alive and well. It was just that they had not eaten for a few days, so they were a little listless from hunger. If the tundra trolls really attacked the manor, it was unlikely that they would abandon the livestock and leave the food reserves for the winter here. Maybe there really are demon worshippers here. Those guys seem to like to set fires and kill people. Harriman suddenly thought of the man he saw hanging at the fork in the road yesterday. He originally thought that it was just a topic created by the two modified humans of the Oliveira army to divert the conflict after they seized control of Valensburg. However, based on the current situation, it was really hard to say whether it was true or not. However, for the 1,000 men of the soft maple tribe, a demon worshipper was not enough to scare them. The captain of the guards simply sent a signal to call the skimming boat to the manor and let the people on the boat enter the ruins together to search for spoils of war. In the end, they really did find a wine cellar that was not small. There were some brewed wine stored in it. Moreover, in the residential area of the manor, they also found some stored food, meat, as well as jewelry and bags of money that belonged to the owner of this place. In addition, there were a dozen fat pigs that were chased out of the barn. This time, the skimming boat scouting ahead could be said to have a bountiful harvest. Because there were too many people present, the money and jewelry that they obtained had to be handed over, and there was no way to secretly hide it. However, the food, various cured meats, and a dozen fat pigs could be sold to the army cooks. They could get money from the Lord. Chapter 11:13. The news from the advance party caused the council of the soft maple people to be reconvened. The Lord's tents were set up next to a pile of granite. These rocks seemed to imitate the mountains in the distance, standing abruptly on the grassland, forming a simple natural shelter. Demon worshippers, Lord Rec commented slowly as he sipped his steaming milk tea. Sounds like a gift. The other lords of the soft maple people also expressed their opinions, but they generally felt that this was a good opportunity. Before they met with their allies in Jomis, they could attack and take down Valensburg in one fell swoop. Besides, a bird in the hand was worth two in the bush. The Jomis had been raiding the north of Tapt for a long time, while the soft maple people had just landed. They had not had any decent gains yet. The wealth of Valensburg could temporarily appease the hunger of the soft maple people. Grisus had been silent all this time. He was Rec's son-in-law and the mayor of the soft maple people. He was the most powerful soft maple noble. Therefore, the other soft maple nobles were waiting for him to express his opinion. The prince often talks about the trials of a nation, he said after some thought. He thought for a moment and said, "My favorite passage goes like this. If the enemy comes with a sword, open the door and talk, but you must also hold the sword tightly. If the enemy comes empty-handed, meet him empty-handed. However, if he comes with a gift, stand at the window and throw a stone at him." Grisus picked up a small knife used for cutting meat. "You mean, who can guarantee that this gift does not have any ulterior motives?" Grisus said slowly as he tore a piece of venison off the grill with the knife. "What we lack in Tapt is not only wealth, but more manpower to occupy this place. So far, the Jomis may have more money than us, but the ones who can occupy Tapt in the end must be us. Send a message to the 1,000-men team. Follow the original plan and rush to the meeting point with the Jomis. We will go south together." Grisus chewed on the roast venison and wiped the grease on his robe. No warrior wanted to hold a sword or a gun with oily hand. Demon worshippers, or worse, there really are demons from the bottomless abyss in Valensburg. After occupying that place, we shouldn't be the only ones to worry. The 1,000-man army marched forward, and the unexpected harvest made many people excited. During dinner, not only did everyone get a real meal of meat, but the expeditionary army also sent an order for the Chiliarch to distribute the jewelry and money found in the manor to each soldier in public. Even if it was just a few copper coins, it was still the first bucket of gold the soft maple expeditionary army had harvested in Top. According to the Overlord Council's instructions, they marched according to the original plan and headed towards the meeting location. Over the next 2 days, the 1,000-man army passed through 4 more minor noble fiefs under Magistrate Macius's rule. With the advantage of weapons and numbers, the vanguard easily took over the manors. Their fighting style was simple. The cannons on the boats would bombard the manor. After the cannons were fired, the infantry would charge, and after the infantry had charged, the cannons would bombard the manor again. But it was with this method that the 1,000-man army only paid the price of a dozen people with minor injuries. They only lost 4 or 5 people with serious injuries, and they managed to pull out all the obstacles that were blocking their path. The army ransacked 3 of the manors. First, they took the jewelry and valuables. Then, they captured the 3 minor nobles, along with their servants, relatives, and guards. These people would be handed over to the Jomis as slaves, and the Jomis would pay the soft maple tribe money. Only one minor noble was more quick-witted. He raised the white flag and surrendered the moment the cannons were fired, and thus received some preferential treatment. That person was only stripped of his noble status in the southern kingdom of Topt, and he was spared after paying a sum of money equivalent to 2/3 of his family fortune. In the end, that person was forced to sign his name on the document that the soft maple tribe carried, stating that he had changed his allegiance and was no longer loyal to the Macius family. Furthermore, he would continue to guard the territory that he originally owned for the soft maple tribe. Ramsey was a world where magic existed, and Topt Island was no exception. When the nobles swore their allegiance to each other, they had to sign a specific contract. If that person announced that he was renouncing his allegiance to the Macius family, the official copies of the contract in Valensburg and King Vixitha's archives would be immediately sent back. Thus, this matter could not be hidden at all. The soft maple tribe was not afraid that he would betray them. After walking for another day, the 1,000-man army finally stood at the edge of a wide, bowl-shaped basin. A slope filled with trees extended downwards, and there was a lake in the middle. The sun had already set to a place where it could not be seen. Accompanied by the chirping of insects, the lake appeared purple under the twilight. The water seemed to be very deep. Twisted tree roots reached into the water like entangled snakes. The lake exuded a serene aura, and the endless forest seemed to be discussing secret topics. The sky gradually darkened. On the other side of the lake, there seemed to be some blurry houses. The houses were suspended above the water, and from afar, they seemed to be floating in the air. In fact, the houses were actually standing on supports in the middle of the lake. Lake Otephili. Harriman pointed at the lake and introduced it to his fellow adventurers. Tapt means otter crossing. There are many otters living in this lake, and the lords of this area capture hundreds of them every year for their fur. Across the lake is a river that leads directly to the River Shane, and there are a dozen towns along the river. That is where the soft maple tribe will be meeting the Yomians. I hate fighting on the river, second only to riding, the dwarf Golander grumbled, taking a swig of beer. Keyes was unmoved. His gaze had already turned to the distance of the basin. Large numbers of people were arriving from the east and west. They were the other 1,000-man squads of the soft maple tribe. With the vision of the blue dragon's incarnation, he could clearly see that the size of these squads was clearly bloated. Judging from the time they had traveled, they were most likely not as lucky as Harriman's squad. He had not encountered any suitable manners along the way, which was why he had captured so many captives to be sold as slaves. Soon, every 1,000-man team sent out a skimming boat. These boats gathered together and exchanged information about their respective squads. Next, the army quickly poured into the basin and along the shore of Lake Otefali, pouncing towards the small village by the lake. Chapter 11:14. My lord, the guard hurried into the meeting hall. Sheriff Elwyn of Northumbria raised his head from his desk, and received the papers presented by the guard. There are traces of a large number of bandits near the 10 towns. Judging from the flags, the soft maple people are in the south, and they are less than half a day's journey away from the 10 towns. In the north, the Yomians are in the alliance, and they are about 2 days' march away from the 10 towns. The message from the marsh pigeons was compiled into a complete report by the clerks, and Elwyn quickly finished reading it. Immediately, he ordered the guards to sound the alarm and put the entire 10 towns into a state of alert. The surrounding residents all moved into the towns protected by the city walls, and the scorched earth policy was implemented. The 10 towns, also known as the 10 Pearl Towns, was just a name. In fact, the area that the Cheyenne River flowed through was dotted with a total of 33 trading towns of various sizes. In order to reduce competition and internal friction, the main trade items between them were different. However, among the 33 trading towns, only the 10 towns that had been established for the longest time and had the largest trade volume had a complete defensive system. Among them, the river-crossing town that the Sheriff of Northumbria took over, which was located at the upstream of the 10 towns, had the easiest terrain to defend and difficult to attack. The overall shape of the town was like a reef in the Cheyenne River, connected by suspension bridges made of iron chains and wooden plank. The solid platforms made of bricks and stones could be used as excellent positions with a little modification, not to mention that some of the platforms were originally built with the houses of the town's rich families, which were fortresses. During the time that Elwyn took over the defense of the 10 towns, he had completed the reorganization of the local soldiers and the formulation of various defense policies. Therefore, once the order was given, the towns quickly responded. In less than a day, the residents who lived in the smaller villages and towns all brought their families and moved to the nearest large village and town. Because they had lived in this place for about 2 generations, most of the residents in the various villages and towns had relatives and friends. Those who migrated over also brought their own food and livestock with them. Therefore, it wasn't as difficult to carry out this task as expected. Moreover, it was just autumn, and the weather by the Cheyenne River had never been harsh. Even if the residents did not have relatives in the larger towns, the residents could find a place to set up a shack or tent under the arrangement of the town's civil officer. Half a month at most, 7 days at the shortest, Erlewine thought. He had already decided that, after the war ended, he would meet King Vixus and convene a noble council to discuss whether the Macius family had the right to continue ruling that land. Looks like I have to play some tricks. A team of thousands walked all the way from Lake Ortefield to 10 towns. There was a storm on the way, and the team had to set up camp in a forest temporarily. When the storm gradually stopped, the dark clouds still hung over them, but they left the forest when there was still some light. Then, in the moonless and starless night, they lit torches and continued to advance towards 10 towns. The mud on the road slowed their progress, not only because the road was muddy, but also because the logistics team did not want to take the risk of crippled beasts rushing to the battlefield. After advancing for about 2 kilometers, the rain gradually became heavier, drenching them from head to toe. The bone-chilling cold corroded their bones. Fortunately, the Pearl 10 towns had already entered their sight. The soft maple vanguard did not spend much effort and found a place to settle down in a few small villages. The residents here had obviously been notified. The movement of thousands of people could hardly be concealed, even in the storm. Before the soft maple arrived, the people who originally lived here had already evacuated their homes, leaving only empty houses. They did not continue to advance in the rain. The soft maple army was scattered in a few neighboring villages, at most half a kilometer away from each other. They split open the doors, beds, and furniture of the residents here, and used all the combustible materials to make a fire for heating. Then, the cooks got busy again, using the ready-made stoves to make steaming hot porridge for the thousands of people for dinner. Except for the 1,000-man team that Harriman and Keyes were with, the other 1,000-man teams did not have much food left because they did not plunder many manors along the way. In addition, they captured a large number of slaves to feed, so they did not have much food left. This hot porridge was only made after Harriman's 1,000-man team shared their food with the other 1,000-man teams. Moreover, the captured slaves could only barely fill their stomachs with meat porridge that was diluted with cold water. Therefore, when the weather cleared up a little the next day, the 1,000-man teams all sent out assault troops to attack the other villages in 10 towns. They only had one goal, and that was to obtain more food. Otherwise, these 1,000-man teams would have to starve. Worse, they would have to ask for supplies when the Yamshan army arrived. That would undoubtedly reduce the value of the soft maple people in the eyes of the Yamshans. Harriman and his fellow adventurers were also assigned to an assault team. They did not take the boats, but walked on the well-built roads along the 10 towns like the others. However, Harriman and Old Weasel were riding on Carrot and another workhorse respectively, while Cuz, who was disguised as Hugh Hood, and the dwarf, Grindel, were riding on powered off-road bicycles. Before they left, Keyes added half a pound of white sugar powder into the chamber under the crossbeam of the bicycle. The sugar would be broken down by a type of microorganism and produce hydrogen to participate in the reaction in the battery. With this half a pound of white sugar, the bicycle's auxiliary function would run for a day or two. When they finally arrived at a small town called Wantage, it was almost evening. This place was a fortress with 4 tall wooden walls. There was also a deep ditch on each side. At the bottom of the ditch was rainwater that was 1 to 2 feet deep. This was a fortress large enough to accommodate a small army. Harriman observed the walls but did not see any movement above. There were also no fires or smoke. "Looks like an empty city," Keyes said with a glance. "The air is too humid. There's no way to set the city on fire. The rain will extinguish any flames we start." The vice-captain of the assault team walked to Harriman's side. He was an experienced warrior who had been appointed by the Chiliarch to be Harriman's assistant. "Let's go in." Harriman nodded and ordered the assault team, "But be careful of archers and traps." They continued forward. When they reached the entrance of the fortress, Harriman led the way across the wooden bridge over the ditch. His gaze was fixed on the top of the wall. Through the gate, he saw a main street behind the fortress. To the north was a building that looked like an audience hall. Other low buildings, barns, and sheds surrounded the hall. They were built within the fortifications, and to the west was a well. Rainwater flowed down from the roof and fell through the tightly shut windows onto the street. It gathered in the corners of the fortress and formed small mud puddles. Harriman did not see anyone, nor did he hear anything other than the sound of the rain. He dismounted from his horse. "Scout, see if you can find anything out of the ordinary in these outbuildings. Musketeers and archers, search the walls and other high points. The rest of you, follow closely and prepare for battle or retreat." He walked slowly across the yard to the great hall, and Kays and Grindo got off their bicycles and followed him. Before entering the hall, Haramond unsheathed his sword. The two warriors behind him also unsheathed their weapons. On the other side, 7 or 8 scouts with round shields and half-body plate armor also drew their weapons. They entered the small houses on both sides of the street through the low doorways. The hall was so dark that they could not see their hands in front of them. It was as if they were drowned in darkness. They used torches to light a few candles that they found to see the inside of the hall. The silence inside made people feel even heavier. Water droplets kept dripping down from the leaking roof. Using the limited light from the torches, Haramond walked past tables, benches, and a stove with ashes on it. He carefully inspected everything. There was nothing in the hall that could pose a threat, whether exposed or hidden. "Looks like they really are gone," the dwarf Grindel said. Old Weather used a torch to light a brazier he found. The rising flames illuminated more of the hall. A seat that probably belonged to the mayor stood at the far end. Looking through the doorways on both sides, there seemed to be rooms behind it and a second floor above. Kays went deeper into the hall, past the throne, and entered through the right doorway. A moment later he came back through the left doorway, shaking his head with a piece of bread in his hand. "No one," he said. "But the storeroom at the back is full of things. It looks like they didn't have time to move them." "They fled," Grindel shrugged. "They left in a hurry. I suppose they didn't want to fight." That seemed to be the case, but Haramond was still uneasy. Taking the torch, he found the stairs leading north and scanned the upper rooms. He found beds, chairs, and tables, as well as several jewel boxes that had been opened but no longer contained anything of value. There were no hidden taps either. From the south-facing window, he could see the courtyard. Even more commando soldiers were waiting. They looked cold and pitiful in the drizzle. He returned to the lower floor. "We'll spend the night here," he said. "Bolt the gate, tie the horses to dry places in the storehouses and sheds, and let the men in to eat and warm themselves. You can eat more, but don't waste it." The second in command of the commandos nodded and went away. Haramond found a pile of wood nearby and kindled a fire in the hearth. Then he went to the storeroom to look at the treasure Kays had just discovered. On the shelves he found cheese, bread, eggs, baskets of dried mushrooms and fruit, barrels of beer and wine, which had bent the shelves. From the ceiling hung a dozen smoked pork legs, crusted with salt. He could not imagine why the men had taken everything else away but left the store, but his mouth watered at the sight of so much food. Still, before letting the men carry it away, he cautiously checked to see if it had been poisoned. The result was negative. That was good news. He took down the ham and carried it into the main room. Grindel came in and shook the rain from his head and beard. The dwarf took the ham from Haramond's hand and put it on the table in the middle of the room. There was a loud crash as he broke off part of the crust. "Let's eat something good tonight," he said. And so they did. Chapter 11:15. The storerooms had been empty long before sunrise, and every man in the great house in Wantage was full of food and wine, and some of the food was piled up on the dry floor of the house, ready to be carried to the rear after daybreak. At last the rain stopped, and the clouds parted to reveal the stars. But Haramond decided to wait until morning, so that the men of the raiding party could sleep for a few more hours. At sunrise he stood on the wall of the fort and gazed into the distance. As far as the eye could see were fields, pastures, and lumberyards. Haramond saw many of the oaks, tall and straight, suitable for building ships as keels, ribs, or planks. On the northern horizon a green ridge ran from east to west, and the light of dawn shone in its center, and a thin mist hung over the rolling hills. Unlike the hamlets they had seen before, the fort of Wantage was more strongly defended, with openings for archers and peepholes in the walls. Above the gate was a narrow ramp through which the defenders could attack the enemy on the bridge. Haramond couldn't understand why the people of Southern Tapt would give up on a place that was easy to defend but hard to attack. Suddenly he heard footsteps coming up the wooden stairs, and turning round he saw Hugh Hood, the young rifleman, climbing up the wall and standing beside him. They leaned together against the rain-soaked wood, their arms wrapped around the top. The golden light of dawn fell on Hugh Hood's eyes, which were dark gold and cobalt blue, and Harriman felt that his fellow adventurer might have something to say to him. But Hugh Hood merely stretched himself, and suddenly pointed to the southeast. "What is that?" he said. Harriman squinted in the direction he was pointing, and took a step back from the wall. There was a black line in the direction of the wharf at Wantage, and it grew thicker and longer as time passed. "It's an army," he said. Immediately after, Harriman turned around and ran down the stairs, almost jumping down. He then ran across the courtyard towards the big house. He rushed into the house, roused the soft maple men sleeping on the floor, and jostled the men, who were still half awake. Harriman kicked them and roared at them. "The Topt army is coming," he cried. "Take up your weapons. Everyone, go to the courtyard." "Tap's army?" Grinder sat up, seeing stars, and pushed away a basket of apple cores which someone had poured over him while he was sleeping. "I thought they wouldn't march in the rain. Otherwise, they wouldn't have left this place for us." "So do I," said Harriman. "They must have crossed the river overnight. Moreover, the patrol boats on the river haven't discovered it yet." On the other side of the room, the vice-captain of the commando team said with a frown, "In other words, the willpower of those Taps is stronger than I thought." Harriman had thought of this as well. "It doesn't matter now," he said. Then he turned and left the house. In the courtyard, he shouted to Keyes, "What did you see?" 500 men, at least." The young gunner gestured. Harriman was angry at his own stupidity. He had entered Wantage in search of supplies, but now he could not help suspecting that the food the Taps had left behind was actually bait to keep the commandos there until the army could come and kill them. The sun had not yet risen above the city walls when his men came out of the house, blew on their fists, and stepped into the cold morning mist. When the commandos were assembled, Harriman climbed halfway up the stairs, turned to face them, and gave them a sincere speech. "We will hold our ground here," he said, "until the last man is killed. If we try to escape, the Taps will easily see us, and they will know our true numbers. They will probably catch up with us and kill us. But that's not what worries me," Harriman said, pointing to the north. "The allied army of the Jomites will arrive in 2 days. Whether or not the soft maple men are good warriors will soon be exposed to their allies. We must hold off the Taps army here." He pointed to the wet ground under his feet. "We may be few, but the Taps can't know how many warriors are standing behind the walls. They don't know who they are going to fight." He drew his sword and raised it high. "After today, they will know who we are. After today, all of Tapt will tremble because of our names, because we are true warriors." His men roared in reply, and many of them raised their weapons. Harriman descended the stairs with some relief. He ordered the men to hold up the gate of Wantage with the heaviest beams they could find in the fort. Then he ordered a fire to be built in the great house of all the wood they could find. The tables and benches were used as fuel, and every stone was thrown into the flames. Glinder soon found Gelmond, who nodded with satisfaction at the preparations, and pointed to a large pot on a barbecue. "We haven't much fat to cook it, but we can fill it with water and boil it at the top of the wall. Stir in some horse dung and mud," said Harriman. "Something that will stick to the Saxon flesh. But melt away as much of the fat as we can." The dwarf nodded again and went to see that these things were carried out smoothly, while Harriman returned to the yard. He found that the gate had been well fortified and could withstand a great deal of impact. He did not know if it would withstand several waves of attacks from the Taps, but it was not far from the village where the 1,000 men were stationed. In theory, after receiving the message, the main force could reach Wantage in half a day's march. How did they evade the river patrol boats? Harriman was puzzled. And they sent so many people at once. The oars fell, cutting through the gloomy water. They cut through the dark water, stirring up the mud at the bottom. Grove leaned on the railing at the prow of the boat, using a torch to drive away the darkness. He whistled, and a ballad mixed with all kinds of obscene words leaked out from his black, rotten teeth. It had been passed down from generation to generation in the taverns of his village for as long as he could remember. It was quite a long way from here. Grove had to admit that he was not a sentimental thinker. But then again, you could not expect a thinker to be encouraged by the Lord's slogans of "plunder to your heart's content" and "free distribution of land," to travel halfway across the world to taps. To survive here, one needed sharp intuition and a firm will, as well as a sharp axe. "The Lords call the shots everywhere," Grove said, spitting into the Thane River. He was resentful of the job he had been assigned. The young master from Emeraldwood City had been given an important position in the army simply by virtue of his status. Well, of course he had a lot of knowledge, and now he was the assault leader of the advance party. And he, a true warrior of the soft maple people, was now a captain. For heaven's sake, he had not been the captain of such a lousy river patrol boat before, and was therefore forced to patrol in the rain. The Chiliarch who assigned this mission must be blind, Grove cursed inwardly. Only when his fingers touched a pearl necklace hidden in his collar did his resentment subside a little. "Fortunately, I got something good on this trip to tap. Otherwise, who would be willing to risk their lives for the Lords?" That string of spoils of war was found in a lady's dressing box when the veteran raided a noble's manor. He didn't hesitate to take it and hide it on his body. He didn't hand it over and waited for the Lord to distribute it equally. It had to be said that this fellow was full of problems. Had it not been for the fact that his brother Ufrek was a fearsome berserker and that he himself was skilled at sailing, he would have been executed countless times as a warning to his subordinates for his bad habits. As he hummed a tune, Grove stared at the crooked trees with eyes that had become glazed from the effects of several cups of honey wine. They were on strange hills covered in black soil and looked like they were floating on water. Under the flickering light, the trees seemed to be dancing. Grove suddenly shuddered. His grandfather, the master who had taught him how to steer a boat, had told him a long time ago that every river had its own secret. A river as wide as the Cheyenne River might be haunted by some spirits of the mountains and rivers. Goblins with pus all over their bodies, Grove cursed again. In order to encourage himself, he first used his hand to rub his crotch. Then, he lifted the moisture-proof cover of the baton-like spring revolver on his waist. He checked to make sure that the gunpowder inside did not turn into a paste due to water contact. If something were to happen, he had to make sure that he could pull out his gun and shoot immediately. "The dead have eyes but cannot see, the spirits have ears but cannot hear," Grove murmured. Grove muttered to himself as he inserted the torch into the buckle of the railing and picked up a long pole used to search for rods and foreign objects in the water. He had just spoken an old ballad, but it was well written, especially when you were sailing down a dark river. "Let not the bats fear thee, their fangs and claws will take thy soul," he continued as he listened intently to the sound of the Cheyenne River. As long as you knew how to listen, the river would tell you a lot of things. The sound of a heron flapping its wings, or a snake or frog diving into the water meant that it was safe. But if you heard the sound of turbulence at the bottom of the water, it wasn't a good sign. Standing at the bow of the boat, Grove held the pole with one hand and stuck it into the calm water, moving it back and forth in the direction of the ripples. Chapter 11:16. He whistled again. This time, his tone was even a little cheerful. He raised the pole and plunged it into the thick mud at the bottom of the river. The pole touched something, and Grove's whistle got stuck in his throat. He instantly felt his mouth go dry. He pulled out the pole and probed deeper. It was a rock or a tree root. It couldn't be anything else. However, the Cheyenne River was very deep. It was enough to drown an adult. At the same time, a faint sound came from under the water. He thrust the pole down again, and tried to pry away or dislodge whatever was obstructing the boat. At that moment, a splashing sound came from the water. Could it be a large crocodile? Grove thought of the ferocious creatures that lived in some of the rivers in his hometown. He hurriedly pulled out the flintlock on his waist and fired into the water. Bang! The gunshot shattered the tranquility of the river at night. Grove, what's going on? His brother, Ulfric, stood up from the oarsman's seat at the back of the boat and asked loudly. The other soft maple soldiers who were acting as oarsmen put away their oars and touched the weapons on them. There might be a large fish in the river, but I think we've scared it away. Grove glanced at the ripples that were gradually disappearing on the water and heaved a sigh of relief. He turned to his brother and the other crew members, but as soon as he finished speaking, he staggered and took a few steps forward on the deck of the boat with loud thuds. The tip of an arrow protruded from his chest, and blood flowed down his leather armor. Grove! Ulfric roared. The berserker immediately wanted to run to his brother. However, before he could take 2 steps, the entire river patrol boat tilted at a huge angle with a series of creaking noises. A strange-looking vehicle that looked like an olive seed rose from the water and directly overturned the river patrol boat. Almost all the sailors, including Ulfric, were thrown off the side of the boat and into the cold Sewan River. These were the lucky ones. The unlucky ones were directly submerged underwater by the overturned boat. Above the olive-shaped vehicle, 3 cylindrical objects rose. There were many holes on them, and with the sound of the bowstrings being twisted, the arrows flew towards the soft maple soldiers like locusts. The arrow that had just killed Grove was now aimed at his crew members and started a crazy and cruel massacre. Similar situations were happening in several places along the Cheyenne River. The submarine that sailed out of the secret port of River Crossing Town was methodically clearing the river patrol boats on the river. After completing this mission, they regrouped into formations and headed to the landing points that their commanders had informed them of before they left. Those places had some special arrangements, and most of them were guarded by small groups of soft maple people. One of them was the small town of Wantage. Apart from the soldiers, there were also some druids in the submarines. They were carrying some giant wooden sculptures with them. After landing on land, the druids could use the wood gate spell to open the gate with the giant wooden sculptures, allowing the army of River Crossing Town to come out. They could use their advantage in numbers to crush the enemy. Hammond gathered the few archers in the team and ordered them to take position in front of the arrow slits on the wall. Then he climbed up the wall and looked at the enemy. The enemy appeared less than half a mile away from Wantage. They had already turned north and were attacking the fortress along the small path. Their team advanced side by side, with 5 or 6 soldiers in a row. The whole team was like a long winding snake. The end of the team was still at the dock where they had landed. "How many people?" Hammond asked. "There are at least 500 of them." Quess, who was disguised as the young sniper Hugh Hood, gave a rough estimate after taking a look. "My God," Hammond whispered. "Without a doubt they must have used some kind of trick. The news of the Soft Maple Expeditionary Army must have come early, so they are fully prepared." Keyes looked at the assault team in the yard. "We are not an army, but we must try our best to look like the army that the commander here expects." Hammond shrugged. "I don't want to disappoint the commander here. After all, my coming-of-age ceremony is not over yet." Keyes also laughed. They looked at the approaching enemy together until the soldiers stopped about a quarter of a mile away from the wall. The soldiers in the back spread out to the sides, forming a line of at least 1 furlong, note 1, wide, with 2 soldiers in a row. Behind them was an array of the same size. "They must be expecting us to go out and fight them," Hammond said when he saw the enemy in formation. "If we do, they will be happy to welcome us." Keyes said noncommittally. "But I think they just want us to know that we can't escape." Soon, a few mounted taps led a group of soldiers away from the army and headed for a forest of elms. Hammond expected them to cut down a tree to use as a battering ram. This made him very frustrated, but he could only wait for the enemy to attack. He listened to the sound of axes chopping the tree in the distance. When the riders finally returned, they dragged the tree trunk behind their horses. Hammond knew the battle would soon begin. "Go to the wall," he shouted. "Bring fire and stone." The soft maple warriors came out of the great house, carrying steaming, wet buckets full of sparkling flints. 2 warriors on the wall were stirring with long poles a smelly, bubbling cauldron. Some of them carried a hanging pole side by side, with a clay kettle hanging between them. The kettle was filled with a viscous liquid scooped out of the pot. At the same time, a large group of taps carried battering rams with long poles toward the gate, staggering with every step. Before the enemy came within range, they raised their shields over their heads. Harriman's archers drew their bows and took aim at the enemy, ready to shoot at any weak point or opening that the taps revealed. Although the soft maple commandos also carried muskets, they were not as reliable as bows because of the recent rain, which made it difficult to ignite the loaded gunpowder. "Steady!" cried Harriman. A shield wall formed by a dozen soldiers followed behind the battering rams, guarding the enemy archers and a second wave of taps. They were ready to replace anyone who fell. When the battering rams passed over the bridge in front of the gate, the bridge creaked. Then the enemy's shield wall quickly parted, leaving just enough space for the archers behind to fire their arrows. They appeared to be very well trained. "Take cover!" Hammond shouted again. He and Keyes quickly leaned against the wall. The enemy's arrows whistled past them, and then the whole fortress seemed to shake with the first impact of the battering rams. "Archers!" Halliman shouted for the 3rd time. His archers crouched behind the defensive structures, aimed at the shield wall through the gaps in the wall, and released their arrows, forcing the taps' archers to hide behind the shield wall as well. During this time, Harriman raised his hand and gestured to the warriors holding the pots. Just as the battering rams were about to hit the gate again, he issued an order. A few soft maple warriors poured the boiling and stinking liquid from the pots into the slanted hole above the gate. The enemy below screamed as the hissing sludge flowed through the gaps in their armor and onto their bodies. Many of them fell into the ditch and struggled in the water. There were no soldiers in front to hold them up, and the front end of the battering rams stabbed into the ground. Although some taps saw this and immediately rushed up from behind the shield wall to fill the gap, Hammond knew how to drive them back. "Throw the flint," he shouted. Barrels of red-hot peat and stones were thrown down from the walls by the soft maple commandos, and the burning rubble of their camp tumbled down through the holes above the gate, which struck the enemy's skulls and shields with the hot stuff. The archers shot at the warriors on the bridge one after another, causing even more warriors to fall into the ditch. However, the tapped archers were not to be trifled with, and they retaliated with a tooth for a tooth. Hammond knew very well that his side had begun to lose soldiers. He could hear their cries and screams. As far as he could see, he saw some people fall from the top of the wall into the courtyard below, but he could not and did not have the time to stop and check on their injuries or mourn for them. Because the taps had far more soldiers than the commandos he led, even though they had the advantage of a defensive position. When at last the tops on the bridge had lost too many men to support the weight of the battering ram, the rear end of the trunk came crashing down with a loud crash and a crack. The enemies who were still standing quickly retreated from the bridge, and retreated behind the shield wall, leaving the battering rams where they were. The shield wall protected them well, and the soft maple archers on the wall stopped shooting. They could no longer find a gap, and it would be a waste to fire arrows aimlessly. Moreover, the commandos did not have enough arrows with them to begin with. "Fuel!" This time, it was not Hammond who shouted, but Keyes. "Pour it on the battering rams." The soldiers nearby looked very confused. They thought that without the enemy below, the hot fuel would be wasted. But Keyes did not order this to hurt the enemy. The fuel would make the battering rams slippery, and the taps would probably send a second wave of soldiers to try to break down the gate. Moreover, they probably would not prepare a new battering ram. The fuel would make the battering rams slippery and difficult to move, and those soldiers would become live targets. Sometimes, in order to gain a tactical advantage on a local battlefield, One had to play some trick. Note 1. 1 furlong, about 200 meters. Chapter 11:17. The Taps had just lost a dozen men, almost as many as Harriman's assault squad, but the enemy still had about 500 men. Their first attack was probably a test of the stronghold's defenses, but the second attack would be serious. More flames and stones! Harriman shouted from the city wall once more. Fill the pots! His men jumped down from the wall with buckets of water. They lowered the heavy pots into the courtyard, but Harriman was still worried that it would not be enough. The little wood they used for fuel would soon run out, and his archers would run out of arrows. It seemed likely that the Taps would break through the gate before the sun was fully up, and Harriman needed a plan to deal with the bloody melee that was sure to follow. Until then, he was looking for a way to slow down the enemy, perhaps by destroying the bridge. Harriman walked along the wall to the gate and looked down. Several Taps' corpses were piled up in the ditch on either side of the bridge. They were soaked in water and full of arrows, and some of them were still struggling. He decided to follow Hugh Hood's advice and leave the battering ram on the bridge. It was too wet to burn. Even if the Taps' men could roll it off the bridge and into the ditch, the Taps would cut down another tree. But if Harriman could burn the bridge under the battering ram, it would be useless no matter how many trees the Taps cut down. It's no use. Even without the drawbridge, this place is not an impenetrable fortress. When the sun was almost fully up, Harriman gathered the remaining men of the assault squad. Including his adventurer companions, there were only 15 of them who could continue to fight. He expressed his opinion, but Keyes bluntly rejected it. It's clear now. We can use muskets. They might have brought enough gunpowder. 2 or 3 packs of gunpowder and the gate of Wantage will explode with a bang. Besides, even without the bridge, they can make a few temporary ladders to cross the ditch. They might even be able to reach the wall, which is only about the height of 2 men. Then what should we do? Harriman could not deny Keyes's judgment. He was also very anxious, but he did not show it. At this moment, a warrior who had been left on the city wall to keep watch suddenly rushed over and shouted, "Taps' men are gone." Harriman mounted the ramparts and looked to the south, where the Taps' army seemed to be rapidly retreating, marching back to the ridge with great rapidity, and even sending out a raiding party to carry off their comrades, who were still alive, trapped in the ditch. While they were at it, Harriman wisely prevented the soft maple from attacking, for he did not wish to provoke them. By the time the sun had completely risen, Taps' army had completely disappeared from the docks. They must have been preparing ferries and other vehicles there. However, Harriman couldn't understand how a ferry that could carry over 500 people couldn't be discovered by the river patrol boats of the soft maple people. However, the soldiers participating in Vantiki's battle were obviously not as thoughtful as him. These soldiers had already erupted into wild cheers. River crossing town. Erlewine had just returned from the secret submarine base. He personally inspected the submarines that had contributed greatly to the night attack. The mechanics also assured the commander that the 10 submarines were in good condition and did not have any major problems. Other than one of the submarines needing to be replaced with a waterproof skin, the other submarines could even set off for battle again if they replenished their fuel. Of course, Erlewine vetoed the mechanic's idea. The submarines were his secret weapon, and unless it was absolutely necessary, he was not prepared to use them in a regular battle. After all, it was a problem to replenish this kind of equipment. If one of them was broken, there would be one less. In addition to these considerations, Erlewine also had to consider the problem of manpower. Although he had gathered the troops of the 10 towns and trained them, compared to the expeditionary army of the soft maple people, even if it was just a vanguard made up of a few thousand men, the number of soldiers he could use was still relatively short. After the night attack, more than 50 Taps soldiers never made it back. At the same time, the number of seriously injured soldiers was also about the same. Even if they eliminated almost twice the number of enemy soldiers, it was still not a great victory. "How's the casualty camp?" Erlewine asked his guard captain, who had already patrolled the casualty camp on his behalf. "All the soldiers who were rescued are now out of danger." The guard captain took out a parchment statistical report. The doctors performed surgery on the wounded soldiers. Some of the muscle growth moss made by the druids, alchemists, and pharmacists have also been used. Even the soldiers who were seriously scalded, covered in hot oil and feces, after applying the muscle growth moss for a few days, most of them will recover. 1/10 of the healing medicine is used? Erlewine frowned after reading the report presented by the guard captain. However, he did not lose his temper. The battle had just started, and it was indeed not the best time to save supplies. Then send someone to issue a new order. From now on until the siege is lifted, no alcohol is allowed to be sold for profit in the 10 towns. Some alcohol must be stored in the warehouse to disinfect the wounded. As you wish. The guard captain put one hand on his chest and took a step back. Then, he turned his head and strode away while holding the hilt of his sword. When it was almost noon, Harriman left Wantage with a team and moved along the road to several villages where the 1,000-men team was stationed. The wounded soldiers and several people who were responsible for taking care of them stayed in Wantage. Harriman promised that reinforcements would be brought today. After a few hourglasses of hard riding, they passed through a huge wetland formed by ponds, rivers, and shallow lake. This place reminded Harriman of the swamp he had crossed when he first set foot on the coast of Tap. They moved quickly east along the road that was higher than the surrounding ground. This road also prevented them from sinking into the wetland, which extended to the western horizon and even further. At around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they left the wetland and came to a relatively dry hilly area. From that height they could see a huge forest in the north that stretched as far as the eye could see. The people of Tapt called it Selwood. After another hourglass of walking along the road, the forest loomed not far away. When they stopped to rest that night, the shadow cast by the forest almost covered them. This was also the starting point of their scouting in the rain yesterday. A camp was located here, and there was a huge jagged rock next to the camp. It was said that the rock was once a dead stone giant. Harriman's report was quickly received by the Kiliarchs, and several times the number of soldiers led by him rushed out of the camp. The soft maple soldiers were wise enough to drive 3 wagons drawn by horses, which could be used both to carry back the wounded and to carry back to Wantage the supplies they had found. The situation in the camp was not good, and there was a shortage of supplies. Chapter 11:18. Go to hell, you big pile of rotten meat! Go to hell! Ulvrich roared. His body bobbed up and down in the icy waters of the Thane River. He swung his axe again and again at the submarine that had come out of the water and overturned the river patrol boat. Due to the close distance and tricky angle, the cylindrical crossbow launcher on top of the submarine couldn't hit him. The other crew members weren't so lucky. After they fell into the water, they all swam desperately toward the shore and became the target of the crossbow bolt. Poof, poof, poof. The bolts whizzed into the water, hitting them from time to time. Accompanied by wails and fresh blood that floated to the surface, the soft maple warriors who had fallen into the water were quickly losing members. In the face of Tap's advanced equipment, they were as helpless as chickens waiting to be slaughtered. Just as Ulvrich was about to jam his axe into the submarine's skin and slowly climb onto the machine, the sealed opening at the top of the submarine was suddenly opened from the inside. A Tapt with a spear jumped out and immediately aimed his weapon at Ulvrich. The latter hurriedly dodged, but his hand slipped and he let go of the axe handle, falling back into the icy waters. "Turn the rudder to the right and crush that guy," the Tapt with the spear shouted from the top of the submarine. Sure enough, the olive-core submarine immediately drifted to the right. As soon as he emerged from the water, Ulvrich's head came into close contact with the submarine. With a bang, his eyes rolled back and he fainted. When he regained consciousness, he was already half floating in the icy waters. It was noon. He shivered as he looked around and realized that he was somewhere along the banks of the Thane River. His body was caught between drooping dead branches. He recalled the previous confrontation and how he had been knocked unconscious. He then recalled the death of his brother Grove. After that, his memory was blank. Ulrich concluded that he must be in the Thane River, but he didn't know how far he had been carried by the river. When he tried to find a foothold at the bottom of the river, his body felt very uncomfortable. Not only was his head dizzy, even his stomach was churning. He almost threw up. He tried his best to keep his body relaxed. He closed his eyes and let it float on the water until the dizziness in his head disappeared. A sharp pain came from the side of his head. He thought that he must have suffered a concussion. He knew that, in his present state of health, he could not walk to the soft maple encampment. He suspected that he would lose his balance if he took 2 steps, and he was sure that he would not be able to deal with any taps who might discover him. Moreover, this river seemed to be his only way out. After all, the river had brought him so far. If the river was willing, he would let it carry him the rest of the way. He struggled out of the withered branches and allowed the river to take his body away, guiding him downstream. He tried to lift his feet to avoid hitting rocks and other obstacles in the water, but he was basically at the mercy of the river. His body wanted to sink, just like that time in the sea. Occasionally, when the river went over his face, he would cough and gasp for air. But most of the time, the river was shallow and gentle, keeping his head above the water. Apart from his ears, he could only hear the swaying of the river. Night fell and the surface of the water darkened. A chill seeped into Gelman's bones, causing his thoughts to become even more chaotic. He lost his sense of time and distance, hovering on the edge between consciousness and unconsciousness. He bumped into a few things in the darkness. Some were motionless, blood-stained objects, while others were floating corpses. These corpses included taps and soft maple. The river carried them, just as it carried Ulrich. It did not distinguish between the living and the dead. Soon after, he heard splashing water nearby. Someone was talking by the river, and their voices reached his drowned ears. Then, someone grabbed his left arm, and his head was completely out of the water. "This one is still alive," a voice said. "But judging by his condition, he won't last much longer. Is it Taps or one of our own? He's a soft maple. Then we must try to save him. Although the doctors in the casualty barracks are busy, they won't save him." 2 soft maple soldiers were holding long poles and intercepting the corpses by the river. Their mission was to count the number of soft maple corpses in the river, and at the same time, take all the weapons and belongings from them and the tap. The remaining corpses were to be dealt with by the river. The current situation was not optimistic. Is that a big fish that emerged from the river? It overturned the river patrol boats and shot out iron arrows to kill those who fell into the water? The Kiliarchs looked at each other in dismay when they heard the information their subordinates had gathered from the casualty barrack. They wanted to know how the Taps transported their troops across the Cheyenne River, but the answers given by the soldiers who had survived the capsized river patrol boats were unbelievable. However, only a few of the dozen or so river patrol boats and nearly 100 soldiers managed to climb up to the riverbank and run back to the barracks in a daze. Moreover, those people had been soaked in the cold river water and had been running wet for an entire night. Now they were all running high fevers. Therefore, the various theories they had spouted had yet to be verified. "That won't do. We have to find out what attacked the river patrol boats." Harriman expressed his opinion in the Kiliarch's tent. In his view, if they could not specifically defend against the Taps' night attacks, then the Soft Maple Expeditionary Force would not be able to divide their forces to attack the various villages and towns of the 10 towns. Moreover, the army had to be mobilized every time. Not to mention whether the soldiers would be able to persevere, it was unrealistic to consider the consumption of resources. "I'm going to the casualty barracks," Harriman said to the Kiliarchs, then strode out of the tent. The Soft Maple Expeditionary Force had the advantage in terms of weapons, equipment, and numbers compared to the Taps, but their organizational ability was far inferior to the regular armies of the other large cities in the Ramsey continent. There was no need to use King's Landing City as a comparison. Even the regular armies of Emerald Wood, Red Pine, and Lawn Maple were much better trained than the Soft Maple Troop. After all, the Soft Maple Troops were, to put it bluntly, a group of bandits who had their heads tied to their waists and had crossed the sea to plunder. When it came to being bandits, the Soft Maple people were actually inferior to the Yamshans, who had been doing this work for many years and were skilled in it. The casualty barracks were the best example of this weakness of the Soft Maple people. Although there were some doctors in the army, other than those who served the Lord's personal guards, the other doctors and apothecaries were temporarily conscripted and had not received any systematic training. Perhaps they were considered qualified healers in their respective hometowns, but they were not very good at treating external injuries suffered by soldiers after a battle. Moreover, the medicines and treatment methods used by these people basically had their own methods and characteristics. It was not obvious usually, but when there were more injured people, the problem was exposed. Even if they wanted to help each other and share the work, there were times when they could not help each other. This caused their efficiency in treating the injured to be very low. Some of the more seriously injured might not be able to survive until they were treated. Of course, the doctors might slowly learn to cooperate as the war progressed. However, the war had only just begun. They obviously had not learned this yet. Ulvrich felt himself being lifted up. His head shook violently. The fire and embers of the furnace flickered in his eyes. He felt a sharp pain, as if some evil blacksmith was using his head as a chopping block. He closed his eyes tightly. When he opened his eyes again, he saw a campsite, and then he was carried into a tent. "Let him lie there," said a new voice. The world seemed to tilt. Ulvrich felt that it was no longer a smooth river behind him. Instead, it was solid ground. "I'll report to the Chiliarch that there's another survivor from the river patrol," said a voice. The figure then left. "Will he survive?" asked another person. Ulfric felt someone touch his head, and there was another searing pain in his head. "I don't think his skull is broken. There are only some shallow scratches on his body. I'll bandage his wounds." "That's right. This young man should be able to survive." These words allowed Ulvrich to finally release the weak control in his mind. He closed his eyes and let his consciousness fall into the vast emptiness. When he woke up, the light from the lamp shone on his eyes. He instinctively raised his hand to cover his eyes, only to find a piece of linen wrapped around his head. "It's you," said a familiar voice. "You're one of the survivors from the river patrol as well? What exactly attacked you?" Ulvrich squinted and looked up. He saw Harriman standing beside him. "You're the young master of the Green family," muttered the berserker. However, he still tried his best to bear with the pain in his head and tell him everything he saw. There was an olive-shaped boat, if you can call it a boat that can travel under the river. It overturned the river patrol. There must be someone controlling it in the cabin, and it can shoot arrows. It's about the size of 3 boats. I think it can carry about 30 people, since he didn't run away after falling into the water and instead launched a violent attack. Ulvrich obviously knew better than the other river patrol survivors what they encountered. After listening to his account, Harriman finally understood why there was no warning from the river patrol boats on the Shane River when he was attacked in Vantiki. They were all sunk by the tapped submarines, so there was no time for them to send out a signal. However, there were more than 300 people in Wantage, and some other raiding parties were also attacked. Last night's attack, the tapped people mobilized at least 1,000 men. If all of them were transported by those submarines, how many submarines would they have? Harriman pondered as he walked towards the Kiliarka's tent. He had already asked the doctors to take good care of Ulvrich. After bringing the news back to the Kiliarka's tent, the Kiliarks immediately released a few messenger eagles to deliver the news to the nobles who were still leading their troops. At the same time, they were also seeking answers. Did the spies they sent to Tapt receive any information about the weapon? How should they deal with the enemy hidden underwater? However, even though the threat of the submarines prevented the river patrol from being sent out to seal off the Shane River, they still had to attack the other villages of the 10 towns according to their original plan. To avoid possible attacks, the 1,000-man army not only moved out together the next day, but they also chose forest roads and mountain ridges that were far away from the river. Relying on their advantage in numbers, the vanguard managed to take down a town with a complete defensive system within a day. The town called Fieldford was also one of the 10 main towns of the 10 Pearl Towns. The reason they chose this town as their breakthrough point was because the Kiliark's intelligence showed that Fieldford used to be a food trade city. Now that the soft maple vanguard lacked food, they chose this town as their first target. There wasn't much to emphasize about the soft maple's method of attack since there weren't any new tactics. They only gathered their boats together. There were 10 of them in total, each with a 6-pounder cannon purchased from the scale of perpetual order. The boats lined up in a row and bombarded the gates of Fieldford from half a kilometer away. After a few rounds of bombardment, the walls weren't completely blasted apart due to the rocks and sandbags piled up behind them. However, the defenders felt that they couldn't just sit there and wait for their death. They sent out a group of cavalry and infantry from the side gate to launch a sneak attack on the flank of the boat. However, it was also the worst decision they could make. In the process of charging, the cavalry and infantry of Fieldford not only encountered the sudden change of formation of the boats, but also encountered the sudden change of formation. These alchemy boats quickly split up into smaller groups and weaved in and out of the enemy's head. The musketeers on the boats fired without restraint. What was worse was that the elite troops of Fieldford were also ambushed by the soft maple soldiers. The soft maple soldiers obviously wanted to end the battle quickly. They used a large number of flintlocks during the battle and didn't give the enemy a chance to engage in close combat. In the end, the soft maple soldiers followed the defeated soldiers and rushed to the side gate of Fieldford. Although the gate was small, it couldn't be closed in a short period of time due to the crowd of defeated soldiers. There were archers on the wall who wanted to shoot arrows at the soft maple soldiers, but just as they formed a formation on the wall, they were hit by the cannonballs of the boats and suffered heavy casualties. Thus, the soft maple soldiers followed the soldiers of Fieldford into the town. Moreover, they relied on their superior military strength to kill off any signs of resistance from the other side. After attacking for 2 hourglasses, they had completely occupied the town. Chapter 11:19. The wind blew in the night, swaying the treetops and dragging the thin clouds through the starry sky. The higher Harriman climbed the stairs, the rougher the night wind around the city walls. He lowered his head and bent his waist as he advanced against the wind. When he reached the top of the city walls, he realized that there was almost no one guarding the place. In his hand was a basket containing some mutton and carrot pies and an unopened jug of honey beer. "You're here." Keyes greeted him. This blue dragon disguised as the young Hugh Hood was holding a drumstick in his hand, gnawing on it until only the bone was left. And at the feet of the dwarf Grinder, who was chained to the top of the wall, there were even more bone fragments. "Looks like you've eaten dinner." Harriman shrugged helplessly and waved the food basket in his hand. Keyes laughed as he took the basket, sniffed it, and said, "Mutton and carrot pies, I like it." As he spoke, he threw the chicken bone behind him, rubbed his fingers on his robe, and put a pie into his mouth. After tasting it himself, Keyes took out another pie and threw it to Grinder, who was chained and had a heavy metal ball at his feet. Although the dwarf was being punished, he still used his hands to grab the pie and stuffed it into his mouth. "Don't hide it, I can already smell the aroma of the malt. Ha ha. Keys popped open the cork of the wine bottle and took a sip before passing it to the dwarf. Are you trying to test for poison? My grades in alchemy and potioneering are pretty good. If someone uses poison, they won't be able to hide it from me. To Harriman's words, Keys still replied with a ha-ha. After laughing for a while, he turned to the dwarf and joked, "There's a great saying, testing for poison. In the future, if I snatch the food before you eat, how about you treat it as me testing for poison?" The dwarf ignored him. This adventurer's train of thought similarly left Harriman at a loss for words. He had come to see Grindel the dwarf and Hugh Hood the musketeer, to discuss whether they, including Old Weather's clerk, should continue their association with the soft maple. After all, his motive for coming here was not to plunder the Tapoot people. At the same time, they had been on bad terms with the soft maple people recently. The reason for the unhappiness was simple. During the attack on Fieldford during the day, the dwarf Grinder accidentally injured a sorcerer who was related to the lord of the maple tribe, Laker. He also carefully taught a centurion a lesson for talking trash to him. If not for Harriman bringing up his identity as the young master of the House of Grimm, the other Kiliarchs wouldn't have only decided to hang the dwarves with iron balls on the city walls for a night as a warning to others. In fact, those people almost made an example out of Gorindo. As for why Grindel the dwarf was able to defeat 2 people in a row, it was actually related to the attack on Fieldford during the day. Initially, Grindel the dwarf had been very brave and good at fighting. He had even led a team of soft maple people into Fieldford as the first wave. The conflict had erupted in the course of the following street battles, and the fuse that ignited the conflict was a spellcaster who was controlling the skimming boats. After taking over the city walls of Fieldford, the skimming boats directly landed on the city walls. The few sorcerers who were steering the boats had their assistants stay on the boats, while they disembarked and used magic to support the soft maple army in their battle to take over the city. One of the sorcerers was even a relative of Laker. "Burn, you maggot-infested beasts, burn!" At that time, the sorcerer had roared like this. Every time a Tapoot person was turned into a running torch by him, he would let out a piercing laugh, his eyes shining with excitement. A bronze belt was wrapped around his waist, and another was draped over his shoulders. His muscular arms and chest were covered with strange tattoos. He really enjoys his job. That was what some people said about him at that time. Of course, there were also many people who thought that he enjoyed his job too much. After all, it was common knowledge that spellcasters who controlled fire were the most dangerous of their kind. Their tempers were as flammable and unstable as their magic. The actions of Laker's relative were definitely one of the typical examples of such a conclusion. In a frenzy, this guy actually patted the bronze belt and turned the giant snake carving on it into a living flame. He directly ordered his summoned creatures to charge at the various houses in Fieldford, looking as if he wanted to set the town on fire. At that time, the lives of Tapoot's soldiers, civilians, and even his own soldiers were all thrown to the back of his mind. It was as if he didn't care at all. Thus, the dwarf who was almost burned by a wisp of smoke and fire made his move. Grindel displayed one of the characteristics of the underground digger profession. The mud on the ground and the stones of the houses quickly wrapped around his body, and the dwarf instantly turned into a stone monster. He directly charged into the body of the fire snake summoned by the mage, and with a swing of his axe, he killed the summoned creature in no time. Next, he used his axe to plow a deep trench in the ground, completely burying the embers of the fire snake in the depths of the ground. The spellcaster immediately flew into a rage. He rushed down from the city wall, wanting to reason with Grindel, and even wanted the dwarf to compensate him for his bronze belt. "You stupid dwarf, that was a precious enchanted tool." That was all he could say, because before he could say anything else, Grindel used his fist wrapped in rock to smash his teeth, knocking him unconscious. Of course, this spellcaster didn't die. However, not only did he lose a bronze belt, he also lost a mouthful of good teeth. For the rest of his life, if he didn't ask for the help of a mage who specialized in healing spells, or find an alchemist to buy expensive custom-made teeth potions, he could only live on thin porridge. Moreover, being knocked out by the dwarf's punch would definitely result in a severe concussion. He might even be affected when he wanted to cast spells in the future. What's more, the power of his fire spells might be greatly reduced in the future. Due to his status as a relative of Lord Rex, this spellcaster's commanding officer in the 1,000-men squad immediately went to find Grindel. That soft maple person cursed at the dwarf, shouting that he wanted to hang him, and even called the dwarf a bearded dwarf to his face. So, unfortunately, that fellow was hit by an axe from the angry dwarf. Although he raised his shield in time to block it, the arm holding the shield was fractured. The sudden interlude caught the Kiliarchs off guard. However, due to Harriman's status and attitude, as well as the fact that Grindel was a brave warrior who led the troops to break into the city, and that the fighting in the streets of Fieldford had yet to stop, they could only give the dwarf a light punishment. They ordered him to be chained to the city wall, and a metal ball was placed on his feet. He could only be released the next day. However, due to Keys's presence, Grindel didn't really suffer. The metal ball on his feet was enchanted with the Featherfall spell the moment it was hung, and the weight of the metal ball was about the same as a feather. Keys even prepared a roasted chicken for him, and prepared some authentic dwarven beer from the Boardman brand to appease Grindel, who was feeling stifled from being hung on the wall. Harriman also felt indignant about the fate of his adventurer companions. However, because he was bound by the agreement with Grisus, he couldn't leave as he wished. If he did, he would become a famous oathbreaker. For a king who was destined to inherit the Green family and inherit the ruling power of Emeraldwood City, being an oathbreaker was undoubtedly a very bad reputation. He wouldn't be trusted. Leave? This is a battlefield. How can they let you leave so easily? Quess refuted Harriman. Furthermore, they are only asking you to lead the troops into battle. Don't tell me that Harriman is a title used to commemorate the wise and mighty commander? You have to let them see your true value. Even if it's only 1/100th of your true value, it's enough to earn you glory and the right to speak loudly. Harriman pondered over Key's words. You mean, I have to use the knowledge I've learned to prove my value? Keys ate another meat pie, smiling without saying a word. After conquering Fieldford, the soft maple army faced a problem. In this town named Field, the warehouses that originally stored a large amount of food were almost emptied. According to the captives, this was the decision of the commander of the 10 towns, Sheriff Ellerwin. With no other choice, the thousands of soft maple soldiers who had broken into the city could only make a move on some of the larger families in the town. They broke open their doors and plundered all of their wealth. At the same time, they also took away all of their food, people, and livestock. Originally, the soft maple soldiers didn't intend to attack these big families for the time being. At first, they wanted to use a conciliatory method. These big families could be used as examples to show their loyalty, and at the same time, they could be used to supervise the townspeople of Fieldford. However, due to the shortage of supplies, this established plan had to be changed. The soft maple soldiers could only destroy the houses of these big families, and even caused some new disturbances. Because of the disturbances, the soft maple soldiers could only spread their forces around the town to suppress them. There weren't many guards on the city walls. In order to guard against a possible night attack like the one that Harriman's assault squad suffered, the vanguard had no choice but to send out scouts to patrol outside of Fieldford. Fighting, seizing cities, raiding houses, suppressing disturbances, sending scouts to patrol. The soft maple soldiers were busy for the whole day and didn't even have a moment to rest. This army had more than 4,000 people, but there were still signs of insufficient manpower. This was only one of the towns in the 10 towns. If they wanted to take down the other 9 towns, it would be very difficult. In order to solve the current predicament, the Kiliarchs gathered to discuss countermeasures. They came up with an idea, which was to temporarily rest in Fieldford for a few days, then take down the river town that Sheriff Ellerwin was in. According to the intelligence, the main military forces of the 10 towns were in the river town. As long as they took it down, the other towns wouldn't have the capital to resist, and there might even be a situation where they surrendered. In order to take down the river town, they faced another problem that needed to be solved, which was the secret submarine unit under Ellerwin's command. If they couldn't find a way to deal with those machines, the soft maple soldiers might encounter enemies behind them when they attacked. If they were attacked from 2 sides, they might suffer a great loss. The Kiliarchs had no idea how to deal with the submarines. They discussed for a long time without coming up with a solution. Just as the discussion reached a bottleneck, Harriman, who was also in the command room, said, "I have an idea." Among the Kiliarchs, the oldest and most authoritative one was a man called Afkar. Afkar was a capable but unambitious warrior. He was a subordinate of Lord Grisus. Originally, he needed a more convincing reason, but he trusted Lord Grisus's evaluation of Harriman, so when he heard of Harriman's solution, he chose to trust it cautiously and agreed to deploy men to prepare for it. "The submarines of the Taps are very heavy and require a lot of water," Harriman explained. Harriman explained to them, "Based on the description I got from the Berserker Ulrich, I roughly calculated the size of a submarine. It's not wise to put a vehicle like that in the river." Afkar didn't seem to understand the plan, but under Harriman's suggestion, he shook his head and handed the task of building the submarines to him. He then ordered all the soft maple soldiers who weren't on duty to start work. Harriman quickly found a suitable place. A quarter of a league upstream from Fieldford, the river suddenly narrowed. It was a safe distance away from the town and also allowed them to react quickly to enemy attack. Near the opposite bank the river was deep, and on the side of Fieldford the river flowed over a broad, shallow expanse of sand and rock. He had some of the soft maple soldiers cut down the new trees and sharpen the trunks into long wooden stakes. The rest of the men worked on several anchored boats, hammering the stakes into the river bottom and tying them together with furs and ropes to reinforce them. Although Harriman wanted to lie down in a warm bed, he insisted on working hard with the soldiers without slowing down or showing any signs of discomfort or exhaustion. In order to complete this fortification, they spent the entire night. The wooden wall built in the middle of the Shane River was like an impenetrable thorny forest. It completely blocked the middle of the river and connected to the steep north bank, leaving the south bank unobstructed. There was only one way for the Taps boats to go down the river. If they tried to go around the edge of the wall, they would likely run the submarines aground and be at a disadvantage. If they chose to force their way through the rows of wooden stakes, they would be met with another unexpected surprise. At noon the next day, Harriman stood on the bank near the wooden wall. He was tired but satisfied. The soft maple soldiers sent some men to watch the wooden wall, then they returned to camp and rested for most of the day. At supper he drank a bottle of honeyed wine from Afkar as a reward for his efforts. But it was taken away by the dwarves who had been let down from the wall, and they relaxed around the fire with the other laborers, warming themselves and telling stories. For the first time Harriman felt that he was really welcome among them. Even the soft maple soldiers, who had complained before the work began, were now satisfied with the wall they had finished. They agreed with Harriman that it was a good thing. Even if it did not work in the end, it would reduce the need for night scouts. After all, it was a dangerous job to go out at night. Soon Harriman noticed that his eyelids were heavy. He said good night to Hugh Hood, Grinder, and Old Weather, and left the fire to his room, where he threw himself on his dry bed. But he seemed to have closed his eyes for only a moment when a horn sounded in the distance. He rushed out of his room in confusion, and found that the camp at Fieldford was bustling with activity, which woke him up. "The Taps are attacking," someone shouted at him. "To the river. It's right beside that wooden wall." Chapter 11:20. Then, the soft maple people rushed out with spears, axes, bows, and guns, ready for battle. Several skimmers also took to the air and sped towards the target location. They ran along the bank until they reached the bend in the river, where they found one of Taput's submarines already pressed against the wooden wall. It had already floated to the surface of the water, and several other submarines were moving downstream, but they all slowed down, as if they were frightened by the sound of the horn and the unknown danger ahead. The bend was narrow and shallow, and the submarine couldn't hide its olive-shaped body. After the torches were lit, the sharp-eyed people could see them through the clear water. The bottom of the thistles and thorns set up underwater went straight into the mud at the bottom of the river, and the spellcasters had already cast the mud to stone spell to form a huge stone slab. The submarines that hit the logs might be able to break a few of them with their kinetic energy, but in the end their skin would be pierced by the thorns, and their propellers would be entangled by the broken fishing nets, and they would lose their ability to move. The first submarine that hit the wooden wall suffered such a loss. It had no choice but to float to the surface and raise its cylindrical shooting machine, trying to use force to disperse the enemies around it. This was done in order to buy some time for the soldiers in the submarine to transfer to the other submarines behind. However, the soft maple people obviously weren't going to let go of their prey that had fallen into the trap. "Attack!" Afkar shouted. The skimmers were the first to move. Several skimmers quickly swept past a few yards above the water, and some of the submarine's shooting holes were already aimed at these skimmers. However, the soft maple soldiers on the skimmers didn't show their heads to fight back. Instead, they let the crossbow bolts hit the side of the boat. When the skimmers were about to pass over the submarine, they suddenly showed their heads and threw down round clay pots. These clay pots were either filled with gunpowder or grease. Whether the clay pots with gunpowder could hit the submarine or not, they would explode a few seconds after landing due to the fuse. The clay pots with grease, on the other hand, would stick to the submarine or simply float on the water, igniting the flames of the explosion and lighting up the whole river. The submarine that had already fallen into the trap was damaged again because of the explosion. Moreover, the skin on its surface started to burn because of the grease on it. The tapped people inside could no longer bear it. They opened the sealed door above the submarine and crawled out as if they were fleeing. They wanted to jump into the water and escape. But in this way, these people also became live targets. The soft maple archers and musketeers lined up by the river quickly fired at the escaping submarine crew with the help of the fire on the river. The enemy wailed and fell, splashing the water. Although some of the tapped people were also armed with flintlocks and tried to fight back, they had very few guns. They couldn't hit any targets on the already chaotic submarine. Those who were armed with guns would be hit even harder. Some of the submarine crew began to escape by jumping into the river. Those who wanted to swim over the wooden walls were trapped by the wooden walls because there were many nets and ropes wrapped around the wooden piles. The soft maple people would then shoot arrows and muskets into the wooden walls. Those who wanted to swim around the wooden walls to the shallows thought they had found a way out, only to find many soft maple people with axes, swords, and shields waiting for them with hideous smiles. Under the illumination of the fire, the submarines in the rear saw the burning submarines in front of them through their periscopes, as well as their comrades who had been killed. They knew that their night attack plan had been thwarted. The tapped people controlling the submarines knew that they had to choose whether to retreat or continue the attack. Although there were still 9 submarines in good condition, they were not prepared to take the risk. Instead, they turned around and retreated. Afka commanded the skimmers to chase after the submarines. The crew on the skimmers kept throwing clay pots at the submarines as they chased after them. However, the battle ended soon after it started. Only one of the escaping submarines was unlucky. Its propeller was hit by a few exploding clay pots, and the violent explosion destroyed its power. Then, it was forced to the surface and was surrounded by the soft maple people who caught up. The other 8 submarines were luckier. They escaped into the deeper and wider channel of the Cheyenne River in time, and the skimmer's reserve of bombs had been used up. Therefore, they were able to escape. The ambush went very smoothly. The soft maple people did not lose a single soldier. Afka sent some people to track the escaping submarines to ensure that they would not turn back and attempt a second attack. Then the commander found Harriman. "Good job!" Patting Harriman's shoulder, this white-haired Chiliarch praised him. "Good job," Harriman said. At this time, Harriman had just ordered some soft maple people to take a small boat with sand and ropes and sail to the burning submarine. They had used sand to extinguish the flames on the surface of the water and the submarine as much as possible. Then they fixed the rope to the submarine's shell. At this time, the soft maple soldiers on the shore had already pulled the rope and worked together to pull the broken shell of the submarine to the shallows. Just like that, after busying himself for nearly half a night, with the assistance of hundreds of soft maple soldiers, Harriman finally managed to salvage the submarine that had sunk into the thistles and thorns, as well as the submarine that had been blown up by the skimming boat. They used skimmers and thick ropes to transport them to Fieldford. Then they used a crude but simple method to dismantle the mechanical creation. Submersible, black oil engine, navigation compass, weapon system, crew compartment. Using his own language, Harriman gave the various parts of the submarine a new name. He also inspected the crew compartment of the submarine. He discovered that this type of submarine could only carry 30 people at most. Previously, they were besieged by more than 500 people in Wantage. If those taps were transported by this vehicle, then they would need at least 20 submarines. However, this was obviously not very realistic. Although the skimmers didn't sink all the submarines, they had roughly counted their numbers. Excluding the submarines that fell into the hands of the soft maple tribe, there were only about 7 or 8 submarines that escaped. There couldn't be more. Moreover, the TAP's commander had most likely received the news that the soft maple people had joined forces. If he used the submarines to launch a night attack again, how could he send out fewer people than the small assault team that attacked the soft maple people? It was purely a meaningless tactic to add fuel to the fire. Fortunately, Harriman found the answer to his question by salvaging the bodies of the TAP's soldiers floating in the Cheyenne River. The soft maple people discovered the corpses of 2 Taputes who were not wearing any armor. They only carried a short, thick wooden stick on their backs and wore linen shirt. After identifying them, they found that they were spellcasters among the Tap. Both of them were druids. As for the short and thick wooden sticks, or wooden stakes, would be more appropriate to describe them. On their backs, they were their spellcasting tools. They were 2 living totem poles. As long as a specific druid spell was cast on them, they would take root and sprout. Soon, they would grow into trees that were as thick as 2 people hugging each other. Considering that druid spells included the wood elemental spell, the secret of how the Taps transported a large number of troops to the rear of the soft maple people was naturally explained. The next morning, after a short rest of a few hourglasses, Harriman attended the new Chiliarch meeting with his findings and revealed his findings to the commanders of the soft maple people. They listened to the report very patiently and immediately fell into a heated discussion. "We have to find an opportunity to sink all the submarines of the Tap. Last night's ambush at the bend in the river can only be found by chance. It's impossible to find an opportunity to launch an ambush every time. If we go straight for River Crossing Town, it'll be fine if we can break into the city in a short time. If we start a siege, those people might use the submarines and druids to stab us in the back at any time," a Chiliarch said vehemently. However, his suggestion was immediately questioned by the Commander-in-Chief, Afka. "How are you going to destroy those submarines? Currently, the only effective method we know is to use skimmers to bombard them. Even if we assume that those submarines are all docked in a certain dock in River Crossing Town and not scattered in other secret locations, we don't have many skimmers. However, we don't have many skimming boats. Moreover, although oil is relatively easy to obtain, we don't have much gunpowder left to make explosive. We can't replenish gunpowder at any time. In addition, we need to fire a large number of cannons during a siege. Our gunpowder reserves aren't enough to support a full-scale bombardment of River Crossing Town. As long as those submarines are well hidden, we won't be able to pose a threat to them. The Kiliarchs kept arguing with each other. Fortunately, they had just won a battle, so they were in a good mood. Therefore, no serious disputes broke out. In the end, it was Harriman who stopped their discussion, which was gradually going astray, and proposed a plan that made use of the geographical advantage. Moreover, when all the Kiliarchs heard the plan, they suddenly felt enlightened. They felt that Harriman's proposal was very executable. However, they did not know that the reason Harriman was able to propose a plan that made use of the geographical advantage was actually inspired by Keyes, who was far more knowledgeable about Tapt than they were, and who also wanted to deal with the matters related to the 10 towns as soon as possible. It was Keyes, who had disguised himself as Hugh Hood, who had told Harriman a short story about his hometown last night. This allowed Harriman to come up with a plan to completely destroy Tapt's submarine fleet, and possibly even break through River Crossing Town. The specific content of the story was nothing new. However, it contained elements such as flooding the 3 armies, transporting wood by river, and releasing water from a dam. Keyes had just randomly made it into a story that was purely casual. Chapter 11:21. Traveling 5 kilometers to the north from Fieldford, and then a dozen kilometers to the west, Hallimond led over 1,000 men across almost half of Selwood Forest, over 2 tall mountain peaks, and finally circled around Rivercross Town to arrive at the source of the Shane River. This river that passed through 10 towns and flowed to the east was actually formed by the convergence of several forked rivers. The rivers that were not specifically marked on the map converged at a specific location, and after years of erosion, they formed a medium-sized lake. Lake Minimo, that's what the Taps call it, Keyes said to Harriman, pointing to the lake. If translated into Ramsey, it should be a very small lake. As he spoke, he smiled and shook his head, as if he felt sorry for the name of this beautiful lake. However, with so many soft maple people here, it was unlikely that Lake Minimo would be associated with beautiful in the future. This was indeed the case. The first step of Harriman's plan for the soft maple people was to carry out an earth-shattering transformation of Lake Minimo. First, a few spellcasters would summon water elementals and use these elemental creatures to help them clean up the waterway. Then, under the influence of the water elementals, the soft maple people would pick up tools such as shovels and baskets to dig up large amounts of silt from the bottom of the lake and pile it up on the shore to build a mud dam. Finally, the spellcasters would take turns to cast the mud-to-stone spell to turn the mud dam into a stone dam. In addition to digging up the mud, the soft maple people were also arranged to cut down trees. They had to cut down the trees that were straight enough. It did not matter if they skinned the bark, but they definitely had to cut off all the branches. Moreover, to reduce the friction between the trees, Harriman also let the mages cast the grease spell again, pouring black magic grease over the piles of trees piled up beside the dam. Although the preparation work sounded simple, it was actually a rather large project, and there were many difficulties involved. First of all, just to cut down the trees and dig deeper into Lake Minimo, they had to mobilize more than 1,000 people for 3 days of high-intensity work. Even with the assistance of a spellcaster, this amount of work was enough to tire a robust soft maple man to the point that his palms would blister, his legs would weaken, and he would not be able to hold an axe. Not to mention, in order not to be discovered by the river crossing town, which was located about 5 miles downstream of Lake Minimo, these more than 1,000 people could only rely on dry food to survive. For 3 whole days, they couldn't light a fire at all. Even though they were drenched from working in the mud for a whole day, they could only snuggle up to each other for warmth at night. Basically, if this project ended in failure, it would be difficult for these more than 1,000 people to recover without 10 days to half a month of rest. Secondly, during the construction of the rock dam, even though Harriman had planned well in advance, there were still many problems during the actual construction. One of the most fatal miscalculations was that the structure that was originally intended to be a drainage outlet could not completely block the lake water that was gathered by the rock dam. Had it not been for Halliman's sudden inspiration to summon an even more powerful water elemental elder, allowing it to display its extraordinary characteristics, attaching itself to the structure of the drainage opening as a living blockage, the entire dam might not have been able to gather enough water. If that was the case, the efforts of so many people would have been wasted. In the end, in order to conceal this project, they had to be wary of the scouts sent by the commander of the river crossing town. Although Harriman had initially thought that the possibility of this was very small, as the river crossing town was already lacking manpower, and there was no strategic location upstream of the Cheyenne River, it was highly unlikely that Sheriff Ellerwin would send a scout here. However, the anti-scout team led by Keyes had captured and killed more than 50 Greenwood bandits and a small number of deserters from 10 towns in the past 3 days. If even one of them ran to the river crossing town to report the situation, and Sheriff Ellerwin was careful enough, the submarines in the secret submarine base of the river crossing town would scatter to the lower reaches of the Cheyenne River, and this huge project supervised by Harriman would become useless. Thus, 3 days later, when he saw that the water in the reservoir of the dam had gathered more than 30 meters above the ground, and that the entire lake was covered in a layer of black, greasy logs, Halliman suddenly felt a sense of great fortune welling up in his heart. Use magic to send a message to the Chiliarch, and send the word "ready" to the reed. Harriman gave the first order to the accompanying spellcasters. Then, he gave the second order to them. Rest for half an hourglass, then open the sluice and flood the river crossing town. River crossing town. After another routine inspection of the secret submarine base, Ellerwin fell into deep thought. Out of the 10 submarines, 2 of them had been sunk in the failed raid a few days ago. Of the remaining 8 submarines, 2 had been repaired for 2 days without any result. According to the machinist's estimates, if these 2 submarines were to sail in the water again, their engines would most likely malfunction. In other words, the submarine force that was his secret weapon had been reduced by nearly half. How's the defense situation in the town? Ellerwin rubbed his swollen forehead and asked the captain of the guards. How much food, defense supplies, and the like are left? How's the morale of the soldiers and their training? The captain of the guards took out a parchment as usual and reported the situation one by one to the prefect. Now, everything else is fine, but there are 2 things to pay attention to, the captain of the guards said. First, the garrison forces of the 10 towns have sent news that there are deserters among the locally recruited soldiers. The captains of the garrison have tightened their surveillance and are preparing to use hanging to deter those cowards. Second, in the past few days, the water level of the Cheyenne River has dropped a little. It's not the dry season now, so this situation is a bit abnormal. So, I've sent a scout team upstream to check the situation. Erlewine nodded. Both situations were handled appropriately by the captain of his personal guards, and he did not have any better ideas. Is there any new news from King Vixis or Valensburg, which is under the control of Oliveira? According to the news from our Ellerwin family, Valensburg is still busy suppressing the demon worshippers and searching for the demon hiding near the city. The captain of the guards deliberated his words. The situation is not very optimistic. Magistrate Macius has just been buried, and there is a conflict between his family and Oliveira. Moreover, the hidden demon is rumored to be summoned by Macius. There is a demon summoning room in his family's famous steeple, and the powerful tannery demon escaped from there. Hearing this news, Ellerwin felt his head hurt even more. He picked up the pot on the table and drank a mouthful of warm milk. However, there is good news from King Vixis. He just sent a message to us. The captain of the guards knew that Ellerwin was under a lot of pressure, so he saved the only good news for last. The kingdom's Imperial Guard has already left Moshen City and headed north. This time, the Imperial Guard is equipped with a batch of armed helicopters and steam tank. They will be able to defeat the Soft Maple Army in one go. The Soft Maple Army is not as fast as their vanguard, and their movements have been detected by Alavara's forces. This was indeed good news. After hearing this, Ellerwin's eyes lit up. If the kingdom's Imperial Guard defeated the Soft Maple Army and severely reduced their numbers, then the vanguard would definitely receive the news. At that time, they, who had originally come to Tap to fight, would most likely not have the heart to continue attacking the 10 pearl towns that were difficult to chew. Once they left, the alliance meeting that the Yamshan army was going to hold on the day they arrived at the 10 pearl towns would be lonely. At that time, the morale of the Yamshans would be greatly reduced, and the kingdom's Imperial Guard would be able to defeat them in one go. Thinking of this series of good news, Ellerwin couldn't help but happily hit the table in front of him with his fist. Suddenly, he felt like he had regained his appetite. The breakfast he had in the morning was too simple. He was going to ask the chef to prepare some roasted quail for lunch. However, he suddenly noticed a problem. The desk that he had just smashed seemed to be still shaking. Ellerwin stood up and looked at the milk in the pot. Sure enough, ripples appeared on the surface of the milky white liquid in the jar. This is... Just as he was feeling hesitant, a loud and clear sound of a horn interrupted his thoughts. "My lord, there is enemy news." The captain of the guards listened to the meaning of the horn signal. "A large group of people is approaching river crossing town. Put on the armor and prepare to fight on the walls." They were about to fight, and Ellerwin couldn't care less about the ripples now. He could only hurriedly put on his armor with the help of the captain of his personal guards and a few of his personal guards, and put on the armed bandage. In the scabbard at his side was a morning hall sword with a basket-shaped gauntlet. On his head was a steel helmet with a brimmed helm, and on his belt was a 6-sided morning star hammer, almost identical in form to the one owned by Magistrate Messias. Without anyone's help, Magistrate Ellerwin, who was wearing heavy armor, walked up the city walls and looked at the troops approaching river crossing town from afar. From their flags, there was no doubt that they were Soft Maple soldiers. They had a large number of people, and they quickly approached river crossing town from the north bank of the Cheyenne River. The north of river crossing town was an open field with a cliff behind it. A large road snaked along the cliff, leading further north to Tap. The south bank of the town was a forest. Although marching in it was definitely torture, it was a good place to hide their movements. The Soft Maple soldiers chose to march from the north. In Ellerwin's opinion, they had made up their minds to fight openly. "Come on, you bastards from afar!" Chapter 11:22. The cannons rumbled like thunder. More than 20 smoothbore cannons were dismantled from the boats by the Soft Maple people and set up on the north bank of the Cheyenne River, about 2,000 yards away from Rivercross town. The cannons had to be set up on 2-wheeled vehicles that were half the height of a person to move, and they had to be prepared in advance before firing. Under the control of professional cannoneers, each cannon could fire 2 to 3 6-pound shells per minute. They carried out a continuous bombardment of Rivercross town, which had already been marked as their target. About 3 minutes later, they had smashed out a total of 120 shells. At this point, almost all the shells carried by the Soft Maple Advance Army were used up. The artillery base had basically become a decoration. However, the Taps did not care about this. The impact of the bombardment just now was huge. More than 120 shells destroyed the largest fort in the north of Rivercross town, as well as 2 or 3 market platforms built with stone or wooden planks. The length of the town was the same as the width of the Cheyenne River, and there were many forts and platforms scattered over a distance of more than 500 yards. They were connected by many bridges of different quality and carrying capacity, forming a veritable water labyrinth. Normally, if you wanted to pass through here, you would often have to hire a local guide, especially when you needed to cross a bridge that could support wagons and draft animals. It was best not to save money. But now, the entire northern area of Rivercross Town had been plowed by the cannons, and the largest fort, which was also the northern gate of the town, had collapsed into rubble and reefs in the river. "We can't let them fire as they please." Elwyn stood at the top of the fort in the center of Rivercross Town. This was an observation platform with a good view. They could see the artillery position of the soft maple people on the north bank in the distance. He put down the brass binoculars in his hand and gave an order to the captain of his personal guards. "Send a group of cavalry to attack the artillery position deployed by the enemy. Bring the newly trained infantry as well. Have them block the local infantry for the cavalry." According to normal warfare, the enemy's artillery position would definitely be the core of their attack. The role of the other troops was to protect the artillery position. As the artillery moved forward, they would also follow, meet the enemy, engage, and occupy advantageous terrain. The best way to counter this tactic was to use cannons, which were more powerful and had a longer range to bombard the enemy's artillery positions. However, the defenders of River Crossing Town lacked such sharp weapons. They only had a few mortar cannons and ballistae that had a short range to defend the town. At a distance of 1,600 meters, there was no way to attack the enemy. Therefore, Erlewine could only adopt a less advanced method, using cavalry attacks and infantry to advance. As the order was passed down, some people quickly appeared on the market platform that was still intact in the north of the town. Because River Crossing Town did not lack bridges that could be built quickly, the speed at which the troops were assembled was not slow. However, the basic commanders who led the troops kept urging their subordinates to move faster. They estimated that after that round of rapid fire, the enemy's cannons would need about half an hour to cool down, clean up the gunpowder and iron shavings in the barrel, readjust the shooting angle, or simply push the cannons forward. However, if the enemy dared to take the risk of exploding the cannons and fire, then their gathered troops would be in a precarious situation. Cavalry, circle around and gather at the right flank of the cannons. Infantry, form a shield formation, cover the archers and musketeers. Also, move to the right flank and stop the soft maple scum who might come out to intercept the cavalry. After coming ashore, the commanders were still tense, constantly adjusting the distance between their troops. "Open the sluice gate." Harriman clasped his hands and shouted at a mage stationed at the top of the rock dam. When the mage heard the order, he immediately recited the last few syllables of a summoning spell that he had memorized. A water elemental elder who was blocking the outlet of the dam heard the call, so he moved the wooden railings that cut off the water and retracted them into the space reserved by the dam. Whoosh whoosh rumble. Without the restraint of the elder of water elemental, the water level in Minimo Reservoir, which was already more than 40 yards high, suddenly dropped by 1 or 2 yards, and continued to drop rapidly. The surging lake water was like a stampede of horses, carrying logs floating on the surface of the water. All of them rushed towards the downstream of the Cheyenne River. About 5 to 6 miles downstream of the dam, the soft maple cannons had just ended, and the tapped people had just started to react. In an instant, a scene that left both parties speechless appeared in front of their eyes. The surging waves rolled up white foam, and the straight tree trunks were like crossbow bolts, rushing with unstoppable momentum toward the small town across the Cheyenne River. Due to its geographical location, the river crossing town usually had some measures to prevent ice floods in the spring. However, it was now early autumn, and no one had expected such a violent flood to suddenly hit. The rafts and barriers used to block the ice did not rise. The surging waves, carrying countless tree trunks, rushed to the side of river crossing town in an instant. Bang, bang, bang. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Thump, thump, thump. The tree trunks smashed into the market platforms, stone fortresses, and the bridges between them, making earth-shattering sounds as if thousands of people were beating drums at the same time. Every time these tree trunks smashed into the ground, the power was comparable to the impact of a siege hammer. The large stone fortresses were slightly better off. Some of them were only smashed into pieces of stone that sputtered everywhere, and large patches of cracks appeared. The market platforms that were originally built with logs at the bottom of the river, as well as the cable bridges and wooden plank bridges that connected the entire town, were in a worse situation. They were all pierced, broken, and even shattered by the tree trunks in the river. As for the docks near the fortresses, platforms, and the docks where the boats were docked, they were all in a mess. Broken planks and broken trees were all over the place, and soon, their original appearance was unrecognizable. The boats docked at the docks could not escape the fate of being smashed and sunk. In addition, the secret submarine base of Sheriff Ellerwin also could not escape the fate of being severely damaged. Due to its special ability to dock vehicles, the workshop where the mechanics worked and camped next to the secret base was right next to it. When the flood came, the submarines that did not have time to dive and hide were severely damaged by the large crossbow-like trees one after another. Their outer waterproof skin was basically torn open, and the only difference was the degree of damage. Some of the submarines were even in a worse situation, and their propellers were even knocked askew by the trees in the flood. What was worse was that the flood also destroyed the workshop next to the base, and the mechanics were also injured or killed. The tapped soldiers who had just landed on the shore and were preparing to attack the enemy artillery positions were all gaping at the scene. At this moment, Captain Afka of the Soft Maple tribe ordered the accompanying sergeants to blow the horn to attack. More than 2,000 Soft Maple tribe soldiers with weapons in their hands rushed toward the tapped army on the shore. At the same time, on the cliff of the north bank of River Crossing Town, 10 skimming boats all rose into the air and flew toward the largest fortress in the center of River Crossing Town. They were going to launch a decapitation attack on the enemy. Chapter 11:23. All the people under Magistrate Macius's rule had gathered in Valensburg, and a sorrowful atmosphere filled the city from the end of midsummer to the beginning of autumn. However, as time passed, many locals began to complain about the outsiders. In the city's central park, the visitors occupied the most comfortable seats, and in the taverns, they also occupied some of the best seats. In the end, it was no longer just complaints, and some physical altercations even broke out between them. Of course, the city's garrison would soon arrive, and in the name of the Alavra Legion, temporarily taking over the city, they would put an end to the chaos. Usually, both sides would be punished 50 times each. It was then that the people realized that Lord Macius was no longer the authority of Valensburg. From the moment of his death, he belonged to historians, bards, and the memories of certain people. The burial of a lord of a fief required a 7-day funeral. Macius's body was transported to a hall attached to the audience hall in the family's mansion. Usually, this was where he would dress up for the day of petition. This time was no exception, and Macius's body was well dressed. His wife and children carefully rubbed blessed olive oil all over his body, as well as the pungent spices and turpentine traded from afar. Then, with the help of his attendants, his family wrapped him from his ankles to his neck in a white linen that had been smoked with sulfur. Finally, the lord was changed into a robe. Although Macius had been killed by a powerful demon, and his body was torn to pieces, the spellcasters of the family still used spells to piece his body back together. While preserving his last shred of dignity, it also made the ceremony of disposing of his body less horrifying. His outer robe was a simple robe, the same as the one the young knight wore when he first took his oath. However, there were 6 engravings of the morning star hammer on it, proving that the man lying in the coffin had achieved great glory. Countless slender black candles surrounded the coffin, burning quietly. After Macius's body was solemnly placed, the magistrate's former chief director ordered for the fire beacons near Valensburg to be lit. This was a sight that could only be seen in times of war or major events, and the number of people who had seen the fire beacons last time could be counted on one hand. He also issued another order, ordering men to dig a deep pit on a cliff overlooking the city to the east of Valensburg. On the cliff where the winds howled all year round, there were 2 tombs covered in snow. Inside the tombs lay the 2 lords who had ruled Valensburg before Macius. They were both Macius' ancestors. The weather was terrible to dig a pit, and the ground was frozen solid. However, the laborers were proud of it. They endured the bone-chilling winds, backaches, and cracked skin, doing their best for this glorious mission. In less than 2 days, the excavation was successfully completed. The mouth of the pit was covered with a huge red and white canvas tent. Valensburg's preparation work was relatively easier. The 4 kitchens of the Macius family's mansion were like foundries. The furnaces burned continuously, and thick smoke spewed out continuously. A group of servants were sweating profusely as they prepared the things to be baked for the funeral, including meat, bread, and banquet cakes. Steward Peter, nicknamed the Golden Bowl, had yellow hair. He was short and short-tempered, and he kept an eye on the people. He tasted the broth in each of the vats one by one. He also checked every crack on the table for dust. On the day of Macius's burial, a long procession carried the magistrate's coffin out of Valensburg. Because they had to guard against demons that might come out to cause trouble, not only did a large number of wolf riders and a few spellcasters hired by the Macius family follow the funeral procession formed by the great merchants and nobles. Number 27 and number 34 of the Oliveira Legion were also hidden in the procession. According to custom, the funeral procession made a circuit of Wallingsburg, and then ascended the eastern cliff by the mountain road. With the help of several spellcasters, they successfully arrived at the burial site in 2 hourglasses, even though the mountain path wasn't easy to traverse. On one side of the tomb were cut peat, a pile of stones, and peeled wood. May you rest in peace. Macius's son personally gave his father his final blessing, his robes fluttering in the wind. Then, the guards silently lifted the wooden planks and let the coffin slowly sink down the slope until it reached the bottom of the grave. Above, the craftsmen arched the wooden planks and covered them with peat, layer by layer. Finally, they placed the stones on top of the wooden planks, and finally completed Macius's funeral. In the procession, there was a former deacon of the Druid conclave, and now an elder of Valensburg. He cast a protective spell on the grave. The cracks between the stones gradually closed, and complicated patterns and carvings with special effects appeared on the surface of the stones. 4 pillars rose from the mausoleum. Finally, when the ceremony was complete, the procession turned and left along the path on the cliff. The funeral on the cliff was the grandest within 100 miles of Valensburg, but it wasn't the only one. At this moment, many lives had come to an end. Those who were lucky might be able to enjoy a cremation, while those who were unlucky didn't even have the right to enjoy a funeral. They didn't leave behind any remains to be cremated. Every ruler would be fascinated by the people under them. They would play this game before they slept and during tense moments in their conversations. Rulers would look at their informants, just like Grisus now, and ask themselves, how much does he know? Lord Rek doesn't know much. This informant was Rek's personal guard captain. In fact, many of the personal guards of the Acer Lord were spies that Grisus had planted long ago. The informant thought for a moment, and then carefully added, he only thinks that you agreed to let him be the rear commander because Harriman's adventurer partner beat up his nephew. You don't want him to arrive at the meeting and find a reason to punish the young master of the Green family. After all, the Green family has a good relationship with the Yomians. Stupid old dog. Croesus didn't have much respect for Rek, who used his position as his father-in-law to criticize and weaken his authority as the mayor of Soft Maple, even in the Soft Maple Overlord Council. If it weren't for the fact that the other party's family background was truly enviable, why would Croesus wear the same type of armband as him? After thinking for a moment, Croesus ordered his informant, "Go back and monitor Rek's recent actions." The informant then slipped out of Croesus' tent, moving through the shadows of the Acer Lord's camp with ease. It didn't take long for him to return to Rek's camp. The next day, most of the Acer Expeditionary Army broke camp and continued their journey west. Only Rek's tribe left a little later. According to the council's decision, Rek was to bring his men to bring up the rear for the main army, guarding against the Taput people who might appear behind the army. The Soft Maple Overlord was extremely unwilling to accept such an arrangement. They all knew that the governor of the nearby Valensburg had died in an accident. There was no way he could organize a decent army to fight the Acer Expeditionary Army. Rek suspected that the other nobles in the council had come up with a method to weaken Croesus and his son-in-law because they didn't want him and Croesus to take too many military merits. The only thing that surprised Rek was that Croesus didn't oppose it severely. Instead, he followed the council's wishes and allowed Rek to stay. Of course, Rek didn't suspect that Croesus had any ill intentions towards him. They were father and son-in-law in the first place, a community of interest. Rek only felt that Croesus was worried about him, and that Croesus might have disagreements with the young master of the Green family for the sake of his nephew, who had already ruined his future as a mage. He might even kill him. "I'm not a child. Also, this Croesus is always too careful." Rek complained about Croesus as they slowly advanced on the road. At the same time, he wondered if he should write a letter to his daughter and ask her to talk about her husband. In the future, when we occupy Taput Island and divide the area and land, it will definitely be based on military merit. The war has already been fought by the vanguard and the main forces. What military merits can the troops at the back get? This position is safe, but there's nothing else other than safety. After walking west for half a day, the army had advanced about 3 or 4 pale sands. Because Laker had only left the camp when it was close to noon, it was already evening now. The army at the back began to set up camp and reorganize. It would take an hourglass or so for an army of more than 2,000 people to set up tent. Rek didn't let anyone cut down trees to build a wall around the camp. He just found a small col surrounded by hills on 3 sides to set up camp, and sent a few more groups of scouts to stand guard. When darkness fell completely, the cold air that slid down from the surrounding hills made all the soldiers feel cold. Soon, bonfires were lit in the camp. The crackling sound of wood burning and the sound of soldiers sipping hot porridge dispelled the silence of the night. Apart from that, according to the rules of the camp, the army should speak as little as possible at night. As the troops at the back, they weren't given too much beer and honey wine. Therefore, apart from the scouts who needed to be on guard against the enemy's night attack, there weren't many people in this army who could drink alcohol today. However, Rek was definitely an exception. He stayed in his camp and ate the roasted meat that the chef had specially prepared for him. He drank a pot of honey wine to his heart's content, not noticing the impending danger at all. Chapter 11:24. The autumn nights were still hot and dry. After drinking honey wine and eating barbecued meat, Laker was sweating profusely. He wiped his greasy fingers on his robe and then stood up. He walked to the side of the tent and lifted up the felt that served as the door to the tent. The cold wind with the smell of pine and cypress from the surrounding forest poured into the tent and made Laker feel a little cool. He looked up. The moon was well hidden by the fence woven by the clouds. Only a small amount of light shone on the ground. Nay, suddenly, a warhorse neighed outside the camp. Laker frowned and squinted his eyes to see who it was. Soon, his guard captain rushed over and brought him the information he wanted to know. It was a warhorse of the soft maple people, and its owner was a scout who was sent to be on guard. The scout died before returning to the camp. There was a penetrating wound on his chest. What happened? Laker was immediately alerted. He rubbed his cheeks hard to relieve the numbness caused by the alcohol. However, before the captain of the guards could answer his question, a violent explosion was heard from the camp. Flames suddenly burst out, and the bodies of several soldiers who had already been turned into broken limbs sputtered everywhere. Some brave people went forward to check and found that the corpses were wearing the uniform of the soft maple scouts. Not good. Laker immediately ordered, "Sound the war drums and gather everyone. We will prepare for battle." Before the order was passed down, green lights suddenly lit up on the opposite side of the colonel. They were the phosphorescent headlights of the kingdom's Royal Guard army under King Vixitha's command. They projected the cold light into the call and illuminated the soft maple people's camp. Then, there was a rumbling sound of engines. Dozens of steam tanks lined up in a row spewed out thick smoke as they quickly advanced towards Laker's camp. In the dark night, the steam tanks that were painted black looked like huge black monsters. They were pressing down on the soft maple people with an unstoppable momentum. Suddenly, the nerves of the soft maple people tightened. Fire at will. Don't let them gather again. Laker made a prompt decision and changed his original strategy. Also, let all the skimmers take off and prepare to bombard those steam tanks. No matter what, we must slow them down. Not to mention the fact that there was no fence in the camp. Even if there was a fence, those wooden stakes were not concrete anti-tank cones. They would not be able to stop the powerful charge of dozens of tanks. If the steam tanks were allowed to charge into the camp, the enemies following the tanks would also swarm in through the breach. At that time, Lake's army would be in danger. And the truth was far worse than Lake had expected. Although the skimmers took off before they could play their role, the topped nation's imperial guards also sent out their war weapons to fight for air supremacy with the skimmers. Buzz, 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 more than 30 helicopters made of iron sheets, steel pipes, and blades rose into the air from the topped army like a swarm of bees, rushing toward the soft maple boat. Each helicopter had 2 symmetrical propellers on the left and right. Under the control of the pilot in the center of the cabin, the topped helicopters' trajectories were very sensitive. Their fuselages were also coated with fluorescent powder. This was to prevent collisions when flying in groups at night. However, it was also because of this that they did not take off just now, but hid behind the army with canvas. Otherwise, the soft maple people would have discovered these war weapons through the fluorescent powder. Compared to the long and narrow skimmers that could carry the weight of nearly 30 people, the topped helicopters were undoubtedly smaller. They could only carry 3 people. In addition to the pilot in the middle, 2 other crew members were tied to the steel frames on both sides with leather strap. They were responsible for the attack. In addition to being equipped with rapid-fire crossbows, revolver rifles, explosive grenades, and other weapons, each of them also carried an expensive explosive staff. Although the weapons on the skimmers were actually stronger, these helicopters had obviously undergone targeted confrontation training. The moment they flew toward the skimmers, the topped helicopters would take advantage of their mobility to quickly move down and hide at the bottom of the skimmers. The 2 members of the attack team did not hesitate to use their magic staffs to launch explosive magic balls at the bottom of the skimmers. When the explosive balls tore a big hole in the bottom of the skimmers, and the crew on the skimmers were in a flurry, the helicopters would circle back to the top of the skimmers. The members of the attack team would continue to launch explosive balls from above. If their magic staffs ran out of energy, they would throw grenades at the deck of the skimmers, or use their revolver rifles and rapid-fire crossbows to attack the crew. In addition, in order to better control the skimmers, the spellcasters usually had only 1 spell slot on the ship, so they could not counterattack the topped helicopters that were jumping up and down. Therefore, the soft maple skimmers immediately crashed on a large scale. If the spellcasters were prepared with levitation or featherfall, they might have a chance to survive falling from a height of several hundred feet. However, if they were targeted by the attackers on the helicopters, their chances of survival were actually very slim. As for the ordinary crew members, when the skimmers crashed, their lives entered the final seconds. The battle in the sky soon came to an end, and the topped helicopters won a great victory. All 13 skimmers crashed, and the topped side only lost 2 helicopters. On the opposite side of the battlefield, the battle on the ground had just begun. As Rek had expected, the steam tank's charge was unstoppable. Even the soft maple people's muskets could not break the shells of the iron cans. The cannons that could really deal with them were all destroyed together with the skimmers. Because they were in a valley surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, the soft maple people had no way to retreat, and there was no terrain for them to take a detour. Unless they deserted and ran alone into the dense forest next to the camp, the soft maple soldiers would only die when faced with the steam tank's cannons and the topped musketeers in the vicinity. However, even if they gave up their honor and beliefs and became deserters, these soft maple people were not 100% sure that they could survive. In the dense pine forest, in addition to the Imperial Guard's ambush, there were more than 50 modified soldiers of the Oliveira Legion who were already on standby. The scouts that Rek had sent out before were actually found and eliminated by the Oliveira. The soft maple people who had broken away from their organization and even threw away their weapons in order to escape quickly were no different from chickens waiting to be slaughtered when they entered the dense forest. Damn it! Damn it! Rek cursed angrily. The Lord of the Soft Maple People had just used a musket to kill 2 Imperial Guard soldiers who had sneaked into the vicinity of the tent. The 2 men's heads were blown off by the weapon in his hand. However, his personal guard captain was also unfortunately killed. The iron armor on his chest was penetrated by the revolving lever rifle's bullet. Although Rek tried his best to call out loudly, only a dozen personal guards gathered around him. Once again narrowing his eyes, Rek decisively ordered, "Retreat, hide in the forest, and then go over the hill." With that, the fat soft maple aristocrat, with an agility that did not match his figure, jumped on the warhorse pulled by a personal guard. Nay, as if it sensed its master's anxiety, the warhorse neighed and then galloped to the edge of the camp. Some of the dozen personal guards rode in pairs, while others simply moved their legs to keep up with their lord. After entering the dense forest, some soft maple deserters spontaneously ran to their side. Following the commander was a soldier's nature. At this time, Rek did not have the intention to pursue the deserters. After all, didn't he also abandon the camp and did not have the courage to fight to the death with the enemy? What's more, there were still enemies in the dense forest. He also needed more soldiers to protect himself so that he could escape with his life. There was nothing wrong with his decision. It could even be said that it was very correct. Unfortunately, making the right decision after making a big mistake could not turn the situation around. The ambush of the country's Imperial Guards hidden in the pine forest, as well as the 50 transformed warriors of Oliveira's Legion, had the same attitude towards Rek as the other soft maple soldiers: kill without mercy. King Vixith had previously issued an order that he had already prepared burn pits for the enemies who dared to invade Tap. Just as Rek ran into the dense forest with his men and advanced about 200 yards, the ambush quietly surrounded them. A row of tapped musketeers crouched behind the bushes and fired a wave of bullets at the fleeing people with their revolver rifles. Each revolver rifle had 8 bullets. As long as the lever on the trigger was pulled, the action of reloading could be completed. Therefore, a skilled musketeer could even pour out all 8 bullets in less than 10 seconds. At the same time, more than 20 Imperial Guards of Tapped opened fire. Within a few seconds, they had fired nearly 100 bullets into the fleeing troops led by Rek. As expected, the number of people Rek hurriedly gathered was even less than the number of bullets poured out by Tap. Even though many of the personal guards were wearing good armor and weren't killed by a single shot, the horses they rode on didn't have armor to protect them. Almost all the war horses they rode were killed by the bullet. Many people did not have time to jump down from their horses and were crushed under their heavy bodies. Kill them! The Imperial Guards of Tapt, who carried out the ambush, did not change their bullet. The morale of the 20 or so people was high. They threw down their revolver rifles and picked up leather shields, short swords, and battle axes from the ground, and directly charged at the group of soft maple people. 20 against 50 people, it seemed that they did not have the advantage in numbers. However, considering the casualties caused by the barrage of bullets and the fact that the soft maple people were like birds that were startled by the mere twang of a bow, the Tapt Nation's Imperial Guards managed to wipe out almost half of the enemy with a single charge. Chapter 11:25. Laker was in a life-and-death crisis. If he was still a young man in his 20s, then he would definitely teach the guy who dared to use a sword a lesson, instead of only using the iron gate style and wild boar's tooth style to block the opponent's sword and saber. Not only was it strenuous, but it was also quite dangerous. Of course, how could it not be dangerous when fighting for one's life? Moreover, he was not young anymore, and his strength was not enough to support this fight. After successfully blocking the dagger of a Taput Imperial Guard, and then using his other hand to pull away the guard's shield, he used an ingenious slash move. He drew a semicircle with the soft maple longsword in his hand, and then took the opportunity to slash at the enemy's neck. After killing the enemy who came looking for him, he was very sure that there was no way he could defeat the remaining 20 or so enemies. As for the personal guards and soft maple soldiers who were following Laker before, they were now basically cut down by the enemy. Damn Taput gnomes! Laker cursed. Then, he threw the long sword in his hand with all his might, and it just so happened that it slid along the edge of the shield, and pierced into the eye of another Imperial Guard who was pouncing on him. A one-hit kill. Without any hesitation, Laker turned around and left the battle, madly running toward the depths of the dark forest. At the same time, he pulled off the jewelry necklace on his chest, and several magic halos lit up on the boots and robes of the Lord of the Soft Maple People. His boots were enchanted with the instant slip-away spell, while his robes were enchanted with the arrow protection spell. One spell allowed him to run faster than a galloping horse for a short period of time, while the other allowed him to temporarily not have to worry about arrows or bullets coming from nowhere. A few years ago, in order to buy these two enchantment items, he had to pay 40 gold drogos to the scale of perpetual order. This amount of money could buy the ownership of several farms. At that time, Laker had thought that these things were too expensive, but now he felt that the money was well spent. Otherwise, how could Rek run so fast, to the point that he could cover a distance of 7 or 8 yards in the blink of an eye, completely throwing the chaotic battle to the back of his mind? Otherwise, what if a few sharp-eyed soldiers of the Tapt country saw the big fish that had escaped the net and hurriedly took out their guns to shoot at him, but the bullets only caused some sparks on his robe? Laker now only regretted that he wasn't willing to spend more money to buy more powerful enchantment tools. Perhaps after this expedition is over. No, after I meet up with Grisus and the others, I'll use walkie-talkie. While the noble was plotting in his heart, his footsteps didn't stop for a moment. Just by stepping on the leaves of the bushes with the tip of his boot, he would jump far away with a whoosh. Soon, he reached the end of the forest and saw the hill covered with sparse vegetation. Ouch! Laker suddenly felt a sharp pain in his toes. His lower body stopped running, but his upper body fell forward due to inertia. Fortunately, he managed to hold on to a pine tree beside him in time, so he didn't fall to the ground. However, the palm that he used to hold on to the tree trunk also felt a sharp pain. He quickly glanced at his injured foot. The tip of the boot on his right foot had been neatly cut off, and several toe caps had been flipped over. In addition, there was a wound on his palm. Judging from the shape of the wound, it probably wasn't caused by the sharp thorns on the tree. This is... Laker was shocked. He narrowed his eyes and stared at the surrounding darkness. Finally, he saw something. It turned out that there was an extremely thin thread hidden in the bushes where he had just stepped on. It was like a tripwire. As it flew past, the thread cut through his boots like a blade. Coincidentally, there was another thread on the trunk of the pine tree that he had just held on to. His palm was cut by this thread. Oh no, there's an ambush! He immediately realized the problem, but now, he didn't dare to act rashly. There was more than one thread hidden in the surrounding forest. He had just cut his toes and palm. What if his neck was cut by that sharp cold? Laker, who was sweating profusely, suddenly felt a cold sensation on his neck. But when he realized this, it was already too late. A rope that looked like a hanging loop quietly fell from the top of the pine tree. After it wrapped around Laker's neck, the person controlling the loop pulled hard and cut off Laker's head in an instant. Blood spurted out from the cut on his neck. When the head fell to the ground, Lord Laker, who was dying, saw his murderer with his own eyes. It was a marionette-like guy with only one head that looked like a living person. The end of his two mechanical arms were palms, holding two triangular short blades that followed the golden ratio. On his back, there were 8 arthropods that looked exactly like a spider's limbs. This marionette relied on these arthropods to move between tree trunks. Hundreds of metal threads hung down from his abdomen. Some were tied to tree trunks, some were hidden in the bushes, and there was one that was wrapped around Laker's neck. The loop was dripping with blood. Of course, this was all that Laker could see. A head that had been cut off would not be able to retain consciousness for long. However, at the last moment of his life, the ambergris lord finally saw the famous cyborg of tapped southern nation with his own eyes. Not only that, the cyborg that killed him was ranked second in the entire Elavra Legion. His official name in Elavra was Number 2. However, everyone who knew him, including the warriors of Elavra Legion, preferred to call him Puppet Master or String Killer. These two names were more appropriate. Grisus was furious. On the day he received the news of Laker's death and the annihilation of the rear troops, he presided over the Ambergris Lord Council. As the mayor of Ambergris and the former chairman of the council, he also held the position of the current chairman. At the same time, he issued an order to all the Ambergris lords. Full speed ahead. Hurry to 10 towns as soon as possible to meet with the Yomu Alliance. The strength of this southern nation of Tapt is somewhat beyond our expectations. Using the method of communication with the reed, Grisus had the clerk write a letter with a reed pen enchanted with magic. Afka, the commander of the advance force far away in 10 towns, immediately received the notice that the army clerk had reported that the ruby at the tip of the reed had lit up, indicating that an urgent letter was being sent. Afka immediately had the clerk hover the reed pen over the blank parchment and transcribe the words of the letter. The Southern Nation's Imperial Guard has been dispatched. The 2,000-man squads led by Lord Laker encountered them last night. Our side suffered a crushing defeat. Nearly 2,000 people, including Lord Laker, died. Only 100 or so cavalry managed to break out of the encirclement and met up with our main force this afternoon. Considering that the date of the Alliance meeting is approaching, the Expeditionary Army will rush to 10 towns in 2 days at most. Therefore, the contents of the advance force, Chiliarch Afka, are as follows. Grisus gave clear instructions to Afka, one by one. Among them, the 2 things he gave the most detailed instructions were for Afka to prepare a camp and stockpile some food in advance for the Expeditionary Army's nearly 20,000 people. Afka couldn't help but sigh when he saw Grisus' 2 requests. If it was just to prepare a camp, that would be fine. At worst, he could just conscript the residents of 10 towns to do manual labor. However, when it came to food, this Chiliarch was truly helpless. He couldn't produce food out of thin air. As for the food stored in River Crossing Town's granary by Sheriff Ellerwin, a portion of it had been soaked when Harriman used the water to attack. Now, the cooks were busy trying to salvage it, quickly turning the soaked wheat flour into flatbread to increase the preservation time. Another portion had been contaminated with feces and poison by Ellerwin before he retreated with the help of the Druid's wood elemental spell. It was estimated, by counting the number of granaries in the town, that there was less than a tenth of what there was left of the grain that had not been washed away by the flood, that had not been soaked in water, and that had not been contaminated by poison. If it was used as the advance force's food reserves, it could last for about a week. But if the 20,000-plus mouths of the main force were added, as well as the consumption of a large number of livestock and horses, it could only last for a day or two at most. Grice's request was clearly an unsolvable problem for Afka. It gave him a huge headache. He wanted to seek help from the intellectual Harriman, but when he thought of the latter's request yesterday, Afka felt that it was better not to ask. After using the flood to break through River Crossing Town and helping the advance force take down 10 towns, Harriman took the opportunity to tell Afka that he wanted to leave. With his military exploits, he had already repaid the favor of Grice's for bringing him across the sea on an adventure. It was time to complete the monster hunt required for the Green family's coming-of-age ceremony. In fact, when Afka received Grice's message, Harriman and his adventurer companions had already left the soft maple camp. The place they were heading to was west of Wallingsburg. It was the hinterland of Tapt, but there were few people there. This was because that area was inhabited by tundra trolls and other monsters. In addition, there weren't any special products in that area, so the southern kingdom of Tapt hadn't developed it for decades. It was basically a barren land. There was no other way. After all, it was an order from the Lord Council and Lord Grice's. No matter how difficult it was, Afka could only try his best to complete it. He immediately ordered the villagers to build barracks for the Expeditionary Army's main force in 10 towns. At the same time, he also ordered some soldiers to go to 10 towns to plunder and extort rich merchants and small landowners to collect some food supplies. Chapter 11:26. A young gunslinger, a nobleman in hunting attire, an old servant, and a dwarf. This small group of 4, unless they ate and slept in the open every day, would receive curious glances from the locals no matter which town they went to in Tapt. Even though Hammond and Hugh Hood had dyed their hair reddish-brown according to the characteristics of the locals, they had encountered 2 to 3 groups of people who took the initiative to strike up a conversation. Some wanted to sell treasures to the nobles, while others took the initiative to ask if they had nothing to say. These people were mostly the scouts of the bandits who wanted to test whether Hammond was the kind of fat sheep that they could take advantage of. Fortunately, the dwarf, who was blowing his beard and glaring eyes, helped them solve a lot of problems. To the swindlers, Grinder would usually tell them to get lost. As for the bandits who came knocking on his door, he would personally treat them with a battle-axe. In this way, the group gradually reached the wastelands in the central region of Tapt, which was also the lawless land of the southern kingdom. When they walked into a small town and found a tavern to eat and replenish their supplies, another person walked over and struck up a conversation with them. Seeing this person approach, Keyes calmly picked up his wine cup from the table. The reason was simple. The person was a wasp. Wasps were a type of parasite. They were small at first and stuck to the lower abdomen of their human host. Gradually, they grew with their hosts, and after they reached sexual maturity, they began to change their hosts at a certain frequency. Aside from this regrettable habit, wasps were considered a highly civilized race. They had good taste in wine and music, and were even fanatical about poetry. Then, why would the wasp leave its natural habitat, a plain occupied by the Trier bee-men that formed a monarchical empire, and run here? Kith knew nothing about it, and certainly had a hint of doubt in his mind. "I'll speak," the wasp spoke. You're adventurers, aren't you? A dwarf, a gunslinger, a noble swordsman. And an old servant, right? Usually, it was Grinder who came to talk to them. At this moment, the dwarf was sipping a cup of Draken wine, a local specialty, so he only glanced at the wasp. Draken was a rare thing. It was a local specialty, fermented from the sap of a tree called Draken. He stared at the wasp, made a noncommittal noise, and struck a match to light his pipe. His other hand was on the handle of the battle-axe. Out of curiosity, Keys helped the wasp out. He pressed down on the dwarf's thick arm and said noncommittally, "That depends on who's asking and why it's asking." Harriman glanced at Keys. The learned Harriman could tell that the latter had used the word it and not he. He knew that Keys was implying something, so he became alert. The wasp sat at their table without being asked. He tapped his finger and told the waiter rudely, "I don't care what these gentlemen are drinking. Give me one too." The waiter was a local lad. He looked at the wasp with an unfriendly expression, but he did not complain and took the wine. Although the wasp hid it well, in Keys's eyes it was still exposed. To a normal person, this guy only had a broad back and a thick waist, but in Keys's eyes, the wasp's body was filled with countless holes. Its human host's body was covered with slim-waisted wasp's lymph nodes, and the wasp's large, black, pouch-like lumps were fused into the man's back and extended around his buttocks to the front of the host's body. "There's one person," the wasp said. "There's always one person," Keys sneered, then nodded slightly in apology, allowing the wasp to continue his performance. "He stole from me." The wasp gritted his teeth and said, "This matter concerns my harvest this year. Although the probability of loss is unavoidable, it's not important. What's important is to send out a signal. Do you understand a signal?" Other than the dwarf Grinder, the other three understood what the wasp was trying to say. "But what does that have to do with us?" Keys glanced at the wasp and said in a disdainful tone, sounding completely uninterested. The wasp shrugged his shoulders and took out 2 items from his tailored jacket. A small, black wallet tied with a string. He pushed the wallet to the opposite side, revealing the 16 pure gold drogos inside. The other item was a narrow parchment scroll with a ribbon tied on it. He opened the parchment scroll and rolled it up. Inside it were the images of Harriman and Old Weather. At the same time, it was written that these two were wanted spies. "I think..." The wasp was about to speak when he was interrupted. "What's the use of your thinking?" The long gun was still on the table, but Keys's wailing short gun was already pressed against the right side of the wasp's abdomen under the table. That was where the parasitic creature's heart was located. It was symmetrical with the host's heart. 2 sets of organs. In a sense, the wasp had 2 lives. However, if its own set of organs were damaged, then the damage it would suffer would be more serious than the damage done to its host. "Tell me, why are you here? Is the Trier plane cleaning up the parasites again, or is it because of other reasons?" Keys's words stunned the wasp. He did not think that there was anyone in this plane who could see through his disguise. The so-called wasp was actually an alchemical magical creature born in a laboratory. They were an invasive species created by the Sirius, a race of villains in the astral plane, to invade the Trier plane. In the Trier plane, the dominant intelligent creatures were a species called the Trier Beesmen. As highly spiritual creatures and the guardians of the Trier plane, the Trier Beesmen were like bees, with a female queen bee as their leader. Their divination and precognition abilities were very powerful and were highly coveted by many. Some planar merchants even became brokers, introducing the Trier Beesmen's profits to clients from other planes. They earned a living from the commission they earned from their transactions. The Trier Beesmen were humanoid in shape and appearance. Their civilization also maintained some of the characteristics of an uncivilized civilization. Outsiders could not understand their mysterious rituals, and the Trier Beesmen were always on guard against the schemes of the outside world. Apart from a very small number of males and those who were treated as the queen's consorts, the rest of the Trier beesmen were mostly females. As the queen's consort, the lives of the males were comfortable and luxurious. Their daily diet was also a high-concentration, undiluted, high-grade nutrient known as molliper. This food could strengthen the body and immunity of living creatures. However, consuming large amounts of molliper over a long period of time would cause symptoms similar to drunkenness. That was why some of the males in the Trier beesmen's colony were often addicted to the hallucinatory effect. When they reached old age and could no longer bear children, they would fall into a deep, numb sleep that could not be awakened by external forces. When that happened, the Trier beesmen would seal them in amber according to traditional customs. When they truly died, the worker bees would break open the amber and cremate them. The Trier beesmen came in all shapes and sizes. They each had their own job, depending on their abilities. The job of every Trier beeswoman was chosen by the elders of her community after they reached puberty, a few months after they evolved from larvae into pupae. Once her job was decided, a young Trier beeswoman would be appointed as her mother. This senior would train her to carry out her tasks and maintain the hive's order. Many Trier beeswomen had never seen combat in their entire lives. Instead, they carried out other duties, such as organizing the oral prophecies of the prophets into books, raising crops and livestock to provide food for the community, or crafting crowns, necklaces, and other accessories that were unique to the Trier beesmen. They were well known among the jewelers of many plains. The Trier beesmen were fascinated by all kinds of rare metals. The intricate methods they used to craft these alloys showed the passion and dexterity of their race. It was because of their craftsmanship that the Ser in the astral plane had their eyes on them. However, the Ser beesmen considered that it would be troublesome to fight the Trier beesmen, who were well equipped and widely used bee venom. Thus, the Ser beesmen decided to find another way to destroy the Trier beesmen. They used biological alchemy to create intelligent beesmen. According to their plan, the Ser beesmen abducted a large number of intelligent male humanoids and implanted the eggs of the beesmen. Once the beesmen matured, the Ser beesmen would secretly send them to the Trier plane and add them to the list of male humanoids who volunteered to become the queen's mate. They wanted to use the bloodline of the beesmen to destroy the stable social structure of the Trier beesmen and destroy the resistance of the Trier beesmen from the inside. The plan was both sinister and covert. Once carried out, it was likely to succeed. However, the prophets of Trier were truly extraordinary. They had learned of the Ser beesmen's scheme through prophecies. Several decades ago, not long after the beesmen had snuck into the Trier plane, they had been purged by the Trier beesmen. In the end, only a small number of beesmen had survived. Most of them were defective products from the Ser beesmen's biological alchemy labs. These beesmen had no loyalty to the Ser Empire. Most of them were neutral or even neutral in kind. Many of them did not agree with the Ser Empire's cruel, lawful, and evil ideals. Of course, for mortals, things like alignment and beliefs could be distorted or deviated. Thus, even though the Trier beesmen were not keen on genocide, they would still conduct a review of the beesmen every once in a while. Firstly, the review could control the population of the beesmen and prevent them from overdeveloping and occupying the resources of the Trier beesmen. Secondly, it was necessary to regularly clean up the miscellaneous insects that showed signs of deviating from their alignment. Due to their fear of the review, some of the beesmen had simply migrated to other planes before the review. The Trier beesmen did not pursue the matter further. That was something for the rulers of other planes to worry about. Keyes did not expect to see a living, adult wasp in the Ramsey plane, which was so far away from the Trier plane. Chapter 11:27. Gurkha wanted to cry but had no tears. In fact, as a foreigner, it was not easy to make a living in Ramsey's strange world. However, with its own unique skills, it had been living a good life. He had a job with a stable income, and his ability allowed him to protect himself in the lawless land in the central part of Tapped Island and live a carefree and happy life. However, a week ago, he met with an accident. What happened next was like a roller coaster ride, causing his happiness index to plummet. In the end, he tragically became a sheep, as the residents of the lawless land often jokingly called him. Being forced by Keys at gunpoint, Gurkha led a group of adventurers to his residence in the town. Along the way, it had tried many ways to ask for help from the people around it, but its acquaintances seemed to turn a blind eye to it. Some people even greeted it warmly, but they couldn't see that it had been kidnapped. The reason for this was that Harriman had used an alchemy potion to greatly reduce their presence. Keys was also very interested in this potion. After asking, he learned that this potion called Lurker was actually the result of Harriman's graduation work in alchemy and pharmaceutics. Amazing invention, Keys praised sincerely. Harriman just shrugged. I was just standing on the shoulders of giants. The alchemy and pharmaceutics tutors of King's Landing University systematically explained the various principles of this subject to us. If we put in more effort in our graduation work, we can always come up with something new. Perhaps for a top student with the honorary title of Harriman, inventing Lurker was not that difficult. My idea at that time was to simplify a high-level alchemy potion and obtain a weakened version. When it came to academic matters, Harriman opened his mouth. There's an alchemy potion called Invisibility Potion that can simulate the effect of invisibility. It's very expensive. Originally, I wanted to use it to assist in the coming-of-age ceremony hunt, but my father thought that it was cheating. So in the end, I could only try to concoct a weakened version of the Invisibility Potion, which is the Lurker. Spraying the Lurker wouldn't make the user invisible like using the Invisibility Potion, but it would greatly reduce the user's presence in the eyes of others. Previously, due to a lack of conditions, I haven't tested whether this potion is effective on monsters and beasts, but it's very effective on humans. As they talked, they and Gelka came to the door of his house. Before opening the door, Wasp was sure that he had no hope of escaping, so he could only accept his fate. It calmed itself down and took out the key to unlock the door. When it opened the door, it made a sound of grinding teeth. The sound blended perfectly with the sound of the key biting into the keyhole. This was a necessary method to unlock the enchanted door. Otherwise, the door lock would regard it as a violent intrusion. In that case, the door lock would immediately spray out a strong acid, giving the thief or robber an unforgettable lesson. Because the lock was brought from the Trier plane, the password to unlock the door was naturally in the Trier B language. The human vocal cords could not imitate this sound. What Gelka meant was, "I'm the one who opened the door. Don't make me do the 8-figure dance awkwardly." After opening the door, Keys pushed Gelka with the muzzle of his gun and said with a smile, "Do you want to do the 8-figure dance? Don't dawdle." Hearing this, Wasp was shocked and said anxiously in his heart, "No way, no way, this guy actually understands the Trier B language?" However, even though Keys directly saw through Wasp's mind with his powerful psionic power, he did not point it out. Like the other adventurers, he was just looking at Gurkha's hut, which was revealed from its illusionary state because the enchanted door lock was correctly unlocked. The tower, 3 stories high, rose from the fertile soil, but it had not yet been built, but had been planted in the ground by Gokka more than 10 years before, as if it were a crop. Howren did not know where Gelka bought these spores and how much it cost to make the mushroom tower grow so big, but the tower did indeed grow from the ground. The stem was tall and elegant, the top of the cap was round like a ball, and the gills were raised. On the lavender wall, there were a few hoes and shovels leaning against it. It seemed that Gelka still had to take care of this mushroom tower from time to time. Gelka led the group into the door. The inside of the mushroom tower was not very humid. The raised gills were actually ventilation holes. The building had a natural fresh air system. Wasp's living room was on the third floor, and his work area was on the first and second floors. The first floor was a steam operation room. Taking a sniff of the smell on this floor, Grindel the dwarf's eyes lit up. As it turned out, in this space of almost 100 square meters, more than 10 large distillation tanks were placed in rows, and the mixed wort was being cooked in them with a gurgling sound. There was no doubt that this was a workshop for distilling wine. The fermentation room is in the basement of the mushroom tower. Gelka pointed to the ground, but he did not want to take the group down there to have a look. When the fermentation time is enough, I will use a hydraulic pump to pump the wort to the distillation room on the first floor. The distilled wine will be processed on the second floor. As he spoke, he made a "please" gesture. They followed Wasp to the second floor. The space on this floor was slightly smaller than the first floor, and there were no large distillation tanks. There was only a huge condensing cauldron, which was placed alone in the middle of this floor. It's another enchanted item. Harriman looked at the runes on the condensing cauldron and explained to his companions, "Those are magic runes, not the magic circles that were popular in the past. It should be a relatively new enchanted item. Its function is to keep the liquid in the cauldron always at a temperature below 0. A new enchanted item." Hearing this, Keys could not help but smile. He really did not expect Gelka to be so rich. Since this was a new enchanted item, it was most likely bought by Gelka in the Ramsey Plain. And to enchant a condensing cauldron used for brewing wine, it was not a tool with offensive effects, nor a tool for making alchemy potions. There was no doubt that it was the work of the scale of perpetual order. Quess was well aware of how expensive the enchantment products of the Chamber of Commerce were. "Yes, this is the production material I bought legally from the scale of perpetual order. There is a filing document and an after-sales service card." Gelka did not expect Harriman, who was dressed like a nobleman, to have such sharp eyes. He was slightly surprised. However, he was a little relieved. Since the other party could see that he bought the item legally from the Chamber of Commerce, he should not be a short-sighted person. Then, they must also know that even if they snatched this enchanted item, not only would they not be able to do anything in the Ramsey Plain, but they would also cause a lot of trouble. "Blending drinks is what I do for a living," said Gurka, rather proudly. However, when he heard the word blending wine, the dwarf Grinder's face instantly darkened, and he snorted with dissatisfaction. The Wasp did not seem to be surprised. Having made a living in the alcoholic beverage industry, he naturally knew the preferences of customers of all races. "I'm not the kind of dealer who makes fake wine." When it came to professional issues, Gelka was inexplicably confident. He stretched out a finger and shook it at the dwarf, saying, "The blending wine I produce is only to give alcoholic beverages some unique flavor. And to do this, it can't be done without the special raw material Moliper." He pointed at some sacks hanging on the wall of this floor. Keys and the others thought that these were decorations that grew from the inside of the bacterial tower, but they did not expect them to have a unique function. "Through the channels of the Scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce, I've imported concentrated Meripy from the Trier Plain and diluted it to a special concentration. As for what concentration it is, I won't tell you even if you beat me to death. That's my trade secret. Combined with the spores of the emotional collection bacterium, the concentration of Meripy can be used to extract certain emotional hormones emitted by the surrounding humanoid creatures every day and blended into my self-produced base wine to create high-quality Meripy wine." The so-called Moliper wine was actually a specialty drink of the Trier Plain. It was famous for its unique flavor, and people who drank this wine could taste its changing taste. Although many people were curious about how this wine was made and tried to make it, they could not succeed. It was just that they did not expect a Wasp to master the core technology of making this wine. No wonder. Keyes listened to Gelka's words and instantly connected with the brain in a jar of the Ramsey branch of the scale of perpetual order in King's Landing City with his powerful psionic ability. He pulled up the sales records of Maliper wine for the past 10 years. The Maliper wine's target audience is not large. The supply is usually solved by importing. But some time ago, the Trier bees and the seals fought a war, and the taste of this Maliper wine became very hot. Only a few local products labeled as non-hot satisfied the additional needs of the gluttons. However, after putting together this series of information, Keyes still did not understand why this wasp blender did not stay at home and make money, but went to the town to make contact with the adventurers, and even said that it left a signal for the people who stole it. Could it be that there were other wasp blenders alive in this place, and the latter had snatched its share of the business? But the recent batch of products. Gelka picked up a big spoon next to the condensing cauldron, scooped up a mouthful of wine that had been blended with some Maliper, and directly spat it on the ground. Are all ruined? The nearby residents are now frightened by a demon who came out of nowhere. The stench emitted by the demon affects the souls of humans, and mixed their emotions with the stench from the abyss. The emotional Maliper I extracted not only wasted the raw materials, but also contaminated the base wine. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.